All right, well then I will call to order the December 6, 2022 meeting of the Manchester Essex Regional School District School Committee. Public comment. We can't see.
No, but we can monitor on here.
Yep, they can monitor on here. We have one person from the public. Hi, Ann. Are you wishing to make a comment this evening? No comment in person. Do we have anyone making public comment online? If so, please put your name and address in the chat. If you're calling in by, you can unmute yourself and state your name and address for public comment.
This is Davis Bradford at 128 Old Essex Road here in Manchester.
Okay, Davis, we'll take you first. Just as a reminder to anybody making public comment tonight, our policies for public participation are found in section BEDH of the policy manual, and we try to keep it to 3 minutes per person as per policy. Go ahead, Davis.
Thank you. Superintendent Bowden, Avi, and all school committee members. My name is Davis Bradford. I'm a treasurer for the Friends of Manchester Essex Performing Arts and a father of an 8th grader and a 5th grader here in the district. I'd like to take a few minutes just to read a statement from the Friends of. Friends of is a nonprofit created 3 years ago to advocate for, promote, and fundraise for robust performing art programs in our district. In that time, we've built relationships with the performing arts teachers, the district administrative team, and regularly discuss successes, challenges, needs, and goals. And in that time, we've raised over $25,000, held 2 summer concerts, provided financial and promotional support to the high school drama and theater programs, purchased instruments, supported Essex Elementary's composer program, advocated for and compiled instruments for the rock band at Essex Elementary, purchased new equipment for the middle school, high school auditorium, and are doing a number of other things supporting kind of mini grants in K1 through or K through 12. I'm here tonight to advocate, or we are here to advocate for an arts director for the 23-24 school year. We conducted a survey earlier this year, inclusive of current and former students and caregivers at every level of the district, including those families that are children that are heavily involved in the performing arts and those who just take the required performing arts courses. And among other things, 74% of the respondents noted that or recognize a need for a central coordinator or arts director to elevate and grow performing arts within the district. We understand that an arts director is currently in the plan or discussions for the 24-25 school year. We're advocating for this to be defined now and hired for the 23-24 school year. It's unusual for a district to be without, at the very least, a music or arts department head. We don't have that either. Our concern is if we take the 23-24 school year to define the role and then allow a new arts director to get acclimated, little will change structurally for the next 2 full years, which is lost time without a cohesive K through 12 performing arts program. From a curriculum and program perspective, an arts director will, among other things, they can help set performing arts district goals and identify areas for growth, build and design a cohesive K through 12 performing arts program that builds appropriately over time and is aligned to the Mass Arts framework. They can help to initiate programs, ensure that there are proper space for rehearsals and equipment. Like I said, we were thrilled to support the rock band at Essex Elementary, but there were no instruments to provide it initially to support the program, and we helped find those. But imagine starting a basketball team with no hoops or basketballs. They can also help to hold end of program, end of show, or end of year awards for our performing arts high school students, including drama and music. They can think about, is the YMCA, should they be continuing to run the musical theater program in the middle school, or should it be run by the school district and grow over time? From a scheduling perspective, an arts director can help design a master schedule to allow for the highest enrollment in performing arts programs. They can advocate for middle school scheduling so that students can take both band and chorus and avoid this drop-off, this historical drop-off we have in participation of students as they move from 5th grade into middle school and high school. They can help to schedule programs with a consistent and regular cadence so students and families can plan their extracurricular or school activities. For example, the middle school play was in January last year, so many students and families were thinking about their other activities for this year and planning around a November to January show. it's now in the spring. And so some students missed out on other activities that they could do or may miss out in the spring. From a communications perspective, an arts director could provide regular and proactive communication with families in the greater communities about goals, schedules, programs, concerts, performances, celebrations, provide a social media presence, information, and newsletter. And then from a space and equipment perspective, an arts director could manage equipment repairs and tuning, manage sound and tech equipment, and manage space usage as well across our three facilities. We know that budgets are always a challenge, but in short, an arts director will elevate performing arts, bring a much needed and unified vision to performing arts throughout the district, and ensure that performing arts is a priority in our otherwise high-performing district. Thank you for the few minutes from the board of the Friends of Manchester Essex Performing Arts, myself, Eric Vent, the president, Shoshi Starr, the vice president, and Sarah O'Leary, our secretary.
Thank you, Davis, and thank you also for the work that the Friends group is doing. Very much appreciated. Would you mind emailing that if it was a written statement? Would you email that to Pam and to me if you could?
Absolutely, we will do that. I think Shoshi was going to do that tonight or tomorrow morning already.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You. Thank you.
Anyone else on there for public comment? I can't see. Nope.
Nothing.
Nothing in the chat. Hearing nobody from phones calling in, then we will close public comment at this time. Thank you all.
And just confirming that folks at home can see us, and we'll be loading some documents into the WebEx. We're having a little trouble with projection here, but I think we'll be okay.
I'm logged in and I can see it.
Okay.
I can see you, Pam, as well.
Okay, great. Thank
All
you.
right. Student report, Diego. What's
So
new?
a lot's going on at the school lately. I'd say the first like big thing, I don't know if any of you went to go see the musical, Mamma Mia. I went the first night and it was pretty awesome. I'd never seen Mamma Mia before and I didn't know what it was about. I like that's sort of same, everyone was like, what? Like, you never seen Mamma Mia? I was like, yeah, I haven't.
Haven't either.
Yeah, so I went to that and that was pretty awesome. I knew a bunch of people in the performance and it was pretty cool to see it. It was really well done and it was, you know, everyone worked super hard and I always love to go see the plays at the school because it's also like it's interesting too because like I used to go to them when I was little in elementary school and kind of like I would go to them through middle school as well and it's interesting to see sometimes like the people who were in the ensemble when I was in middle school are now the lead roles in the play, so that's pretty cool to see that people stick with it and then, you know, end up like doing great things. I would say another big thing is that obviously winter sports have started. I'm on the swimming and diving team. And that's going really well. We have way more people than we did last year, so that should be fun. I don't know a ton about the other sports right now, but I'm sure basketball will be great like it was last year, and I'm looking forward to going to the games. Another thing I kind of wanted to talk about was just some of the clubs that are going on in the school, because I know I don't really talk about them a ton, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Trying to get more information about the clubs that I'm not in, but this week I'd at least talk about the ones that I'm in because I know, you know, more about them. The first club I wanted to mention was a new one this year, called the Reefing Club or like the Reef Tank Club, which two of my buddies started. I don't know if you've seen the tank over there. But Mr. Novak, the AP chemistry, AP physics and honors chemistry teacher, he's kind of like he's into tanks and stuff. So my friends are super into it as well. Like they have crazy setups at their house, all sorts of stuff, and they wanted to start a reef tank club. So he's the advisor for the club, and we have another smaller tank in the classroom, and it's just all about setting up, maintaining tanks, and there's actually a lot that goes into it that I didn't really realize. Like I just thought you kind of put the fish in there and then
Fish tanks. All I was like, okay, got it. Fish tanks.
fish
Oh,
tanks.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry,
really.
I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
Got you.
So it's to maintain fish tanks and reef tanks and you know, kind of set them up, feed the fish, make sure they're healthy, and I'm learning a lot. It's pretty cool. Another club that I'm also in a science team. which we had our first competition, not our first, our second competition, was away. So we went to, I think it was North Andover High School, and we got to see all the other teams from around the state, which was like pretty eye-opening. It was the first time I've ever went to an away science meet, and it was really fun. It's cool to see just all like the different kids, because we've been doing them online for so long. So to kind of like see everyone, it's just no. So then you kind of say, oh, like those are the kids that were getting hundreds, or like those are the kids that beat us in that event. It was pretty cool to see. And then we also have guest speakers come in once or twice a month, which varies from college professors in Boston to parents of kids in the club who work into the STEM fields. So that's pretty cool as well. Like a lot of my friends' parents have went and talked, and like just the variety is cool. Like the last speaker we had was a marine biology student at Northeastern, and she brought in lobsters and crabs and stuff, and we were able to like pick them up and touch them, and she was telling us all about the work that she does and kind of like her path through STEM, and it's pretty cool because it's interesting, such variety, but I really like it. And I think it's also helpful for kids too, because at least for me, like they kind of show their path to success, and it's never linear, which I think is helpful for students, because sometimes we get so caught up in like, test scores and grades and everything. But like honestly, a lot of the people that came in, like they were never really exceptional students in high school, and then they kind of found their pathway in college. So I think it's helpful for a lot of people, and it's not like, so you don't like put all your eggs in one basket kind of thing. Like you never really know where your schooling will lead you. And then the third club I wanted to talk about was the Manchester's chapter of HOSA, which is Future Healthcare Professionals of America. I'm the treasurer for that group. And so we have a chapter which we've started last year. I want to say Lucas Shan started it last year, and if not, it started before, but he was in charge of it last year, and he and the seniors who were the officers last year helped write a grant to the Hooper Fund. So, and it got accepted, so we got a whole bunch of money from them, which me and the president Charlotte, where kind of we just put in our first like order of materials that we're getting from the grant. We ordered like these little like suture pads, sutures, and then like a bunch of other tools related to like stitching, just as like kind of like an activity that the kids and like us that we can do during the club. Another thing we're organizing, which is it looks like it's going to be in between the winter and the spring sports seasons, is a blood drive through the Red Cross. So that's something that's in the works right now, just kind of like in the beginning process, but HOSA is helping to organize that. And then on top of that, we also have guest speakers that come in for HOSA as well, which is healthcare professionals from the community, again, from like a wide variety of doctors, different types of doctors. Usually it's like the parents or friends of students that will come in and talk. So that's also, it's really similar to science team. Like one of the things like I kind of aspire to do when I get older is like potentially become a doctor. And I will say having all these people come in and talk to us is really helpful. It's just kind of like guiding my own thinking and other students' thinking as well when it comes to, where they want to go to school, what they even want to study in high school, and kind of like what the best option is if you're interested in a, medical profession potentially. So the guest speakers for hosts are really amazing as well.
Excellent. Thank you. It's interesting. We had, well, I'll get to that in my chairman's report, but it's nice for us as a committee to have a sense of the different kinds of things that happen, especially those of us who don't have kids in high school yet, as I know we've talked
Yeah.
about, to get a sense of what options there are and that sort of thing. Anybody have questions for Diego? Sounds like things are like underway.
Oh,
Just in
definitely.
swing.
Yeah. Another thing I would just want to add is like, I think we're really lucky as a district and a town to be able to have like just such a wide variety of professionals like in our own school community and stuff. Like it's always mind blowing to me how many doctors, STEM people are in our own community and how willing they are to come to the school and help people. I think it's pretty cool.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. We love having your updates. So you're welcome to stay or not, how you
Tonight,
roll.
I have to get out a little bit early. I got a busy night, but
Thank you for being here.
Of course.
Good to see you, Diego.
Thank you all. It's good to see you.
All right. Chairman's report, just a couple brief things. That I attended the Student Advisory Council with Diego and the other representatives, in fact, the day after our last meeting, which was great. And we had some of that conversation in depth too about what's going on and what different opportunities there are and how it impacts the students in terms of their trajectory. So that was great. Also did a walkthrough that morning at Essex Elementary and the middle school. And Pam and I will do that with Memorial and the high school at another time. And we're going to be setting up times for committee members to be able to walk through the schools and see what's going on and getting things, getting a view of things in action. Also sent, just so you guys know, I was a little bit late. You've probably noticed I like to send a thank you email when people present to us, and it was a little bit late. So I did send an email of thanks to our SBC members for taking time to come to our last meeting with the Habib report, and their expertise and their questions are definitely helpful because they're the ones who have the experience going through this process. Jake, of course, wears both hats, so you're included in that. And then that's it for my report tonight. The reading of our operating protocol for tonight is with Matt.
Hadn't done this already. Okay, demonstrate professional and collegial relations with each other. Sub-bullet, recognize that authority rests only with majority decisions of the committee and make no independent commitments or take any independent actions that may compromise the committee as a whole.
Great. Thank you very much. That is it for my report tonight. Next up is the consent agenda, which has three components here. The acceptance of the warrants for vouchers 1022 and 1023, out-of-state travel for the high school France and England trips, and the minutes from our November 15th meeting. So has everyone had a chance to look at the materials for all of that? Okay, then is there a motion to accept the consent agenda?
I'll make that motion.
So is there a second? Second? Any discussion? Yes.
I am very confused about the out-of-state travel documents that were provided.
Okay.
The cover said England, but all the information was about France.
There should have been England and France in the packet. If there wasn't, we can resubmit it. Essentially, the high school is putting in notice that they intend to travel in the next school year to England and France. So if they get your approval to travel out of state, out of the country, then they can proceed with recruitment for the trip. If you want me to go back and ask them to resubmit it in a different format, I can certainly do that.
Do we need all of the itinerary in order
I
to
just
do
sent it
that?
as a,
That's
as
more of a courtesy and informational, just so we know.
So can you explain to us, this is the first time I'll be
Yeah.
approving out of state, out of country travel. Is there typically a kind of an educational justification, a connection to the curriculum? Is there some sort of, that's all from the tour company that
Yep.
was provided, it was nothing from us as to.
it's going
its
over
value?
April break, so it typically takes, well, it's connected to the curriculum, they do submit some type of a lesson plan that aligns it. Because it's not necessarily your teachers that are actually taking you, it's not a specific class, it's kind of an opportunity to travel offered to the students.
Isn't it typically associated with a language?
Language, but
So I
Or
feel like in
literature.
my experience with it, it's been French, traveling to a French-speaking country and a Spanish-speaking country. And I was surprised to see a change just because I thought it was part of our language, or at least tied to our language.
We can
curriculum.
kick it. I'll ask Tricia to come. She's the expert on it. I trust her. She sent it up with her approval. I trust her recommendation. And it's routine for us to send these trips out. The literature, I'm saying literature, the England trip tends to tie back to English lit.
Have we done the English trip before?
I can't think of it in recent past.
Am I right that it usually is
Yeah,
Spanish?
French,
French,
Spanish.
Spain, or
Yep, sometimes
something
we have South American trips too. The environmental group used to do more of those in the past. They haven't done so many in the future.
And this is,
So
so,
no, go ahead, Anna.
so is this funded by the family?
We're basically giving the company permission to solicit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's, I was gonna ask, what is our actual reason. for
Giving
having-
notice that they'll be traveling out of state, that we're allowing a company to come in and solicit participation, but it all runs through a third party and we provide the chaperone, so we are connected.
Connected in
to
that
it.
way.
And how do we typically ensure that kids who can't afford it have some opportunity?
That hasn't really come up in these because they're not part of the curriculum and they're not required. They're run over April break on a voluntary basis. If anybody is interested but feels that they can't afford, I would encourage them to reach out to the principal. There's usually a way that we can work with families.
There's a page in there about affordability. So I don't know if you got to that, Jake.
I saw that. It didn't give me any specifics of what that meant, but
Typically, any of the programs that we offer that are self-selecting, we will work with families who bring an issue forward. There's many different avenues that principals have to help families fund things.
Do you have other questions too?
those are my questions.
Okay. Let me ask, Avi, did you have anything come in that you wanted specifically to speak to in terms of the vouchers, questions or anything? I mean, we're gonna talk
I
some,
believe we did have questions about the vouchers that I'm.
and we didn't
remember
have any
seeing.
in our
No.
yesterday, so.
No.
No, it
maybe
was
because-
mostly the budget.
Right,
Yeah, I
okay,
think people were focused on that probably.
okay. So do you think we need to split out the out-of-state travel, or are we comfortable voting on the consent agenda as is?
Can I ask, are we voting on the out-of-state or out-of-country travel? Is it because this is the first time since COVID, or is this a normal event for a school committee to be voting?
Normal routine, anytime a group is going to travel out of state, that it comes before school committee to give you notice, because you're assuming a liability in case anything goes wrong, essentially. Give you notice.
I personally, and I don't know how the group feels, but I personally appreciate some explanation of the school side of it, not just the tour company side of it, which is all we have.
We're basically third partying it out to a tour company to run. Basically, in a nutshell, we are voting to allow the tour company to come in and run a program for our kids. It's not necessary. It has curriculum connections, but it's not designed to be an extension of the curriculum.
And by doing so, we're endorsing it. And by endorsing it, we're assuming some level of liability, which is what we need to.
They're going with education first and they're going with Ipswich High School. Is that what I'm reading in the?
Yep,
Yeah,
and we'll
great.
provide chaperones. They'll provide chaperones. Essentially, part of the notification comes because the code of conduct will apply. So while they're over there, if you need to know that this is going on and this is happening, and if someone's being sent home on a plane, I'm gonna send you an email that
That's
night to
fine.
let you know.
Yeah.
And if there's something that you need to know, our kids are going out in the world and that they're traveling. I don't want to sell short any preparation that the teachers might do with kids who are attending. But again, it's not a class trip. It's not an already pre-organized group of kids who are together and going to travel for a connection experience to something that's happening here. It connects indirectly to coursework that they've taken, and coursework that they've taken or plan to take may be the incentive to participate. So it's an educational but vacation-based trip.
I'll just add that I'm really happy to see students having the opportunity to travel again, especially out of country. It's my first time on the committee seeing that, and I'm glad that we're seeing the world.
So do you feel more comfortable removing that from the consent agenda and voting on that separately, or?
I would appreciate that, yes.
Okay, so shall we amend the motion here?
I
Remind me.
will amend the motion to vote on the out-of-state travel separately from the rest of the consent agenda.
Okay, I will second that motion. Any discussion? All in favor?
Yep.
Any opposed? Okay, so let's do the consent agenda part first then, which now is for the acceptance of the warrants for vouchers 1022 and 1023, and then the minutes from November 15th meeting. I move to accept the consent agenda. Is there a second?
I'm sorry, just running fast. I had a question about the vouchers. Can
Okay,
I put that in?
yep, right. Oh, let's take a second
Second.
and now discussion.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I thought we were already there. No,
We were and then we left.
We
Yeah.
left, okay. It's a very good question.
Mhm.
Can, Abby, what is the Van Loan School?
Yeah, it's a graduate school of education program and we've had for a number of years. And it's funny, sometimes I put these notes in my memos and then after having them in a number of times, I think I've said this too many times, so I apologize, but maybe not. So I'm glad you asked. So we,
I'm sorry.
no, you shouldn't be. Yeah, this is one I probably could have kept in there. So we do engage in a fellows program where we work with the Van Loan School and have a number of graduate students who are here working as fellows on their way towards working towards their, I think it's typically a master's degree.
Mhm.
And as part of that, they can be in a classroom where we might otherwise maybe have a teaching assistant. In this case, we would have a fellow who provides a higher level of expertise. And so it comes at a cost savings, but also provides greater level of kind of educational curricular background. And we typically have, I think, 2 or 3 of them per year. And I think the cost is, I believe, around 18,000 per person per year. So
But you're saying that's actually a savings above what we'd have to have in that classroom otherwise?
yeah, so for example, like a step 4 teaching assistant might be, I think, typically around $30,000 per year.
Yep.
But it's also the CV of a person who's a graduate student is clearly going to be more in line with what a teacher is about to be.
It's a pipeline builder too.
And
Thank you.
we hire them as consultants.
No,
They are contracted services, if that's what you mean.
Contracted,
Yes,
yeah, yeah.
yes, they are not employees.
Yeah.
And all the employment, relationship insurance, et cetera, is on the school, not on us.
So the savings will actually be higher because we don't have to pay for.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right.
I had a question about reimbursement for out-of-district placements. I saw in the, I think it was in the annual budget, that the rate of reimbursement from the state has gone up. Is that correct? Or the,
Are you talking about for the circuit breaker program?
yeah, the DESI
circuit breaker.
circuit breaker.
Yeah, circuit breaker, yep.
Reimbursement for
Yeah.
our out-of-district placements has gone up.
Can I recommend we
Yeah,
put a pin in that? Because
Just
that's
gonna say.
in the budget presentation.
So, but my question is about which,
How would that show up in the vouchers?
so on our, well, I see that some of our vouchers say, out of district place. I mean,
Yep.
I'm not gonna get into them specifically.
Yeah.
But then some of them have, other reasons that those students are out of district. What are we reimbursed for through the circuit breaker
Yep.
versus which ones do the circuit breaker not reimburse us for?
So we don't, just to clarify, I'm not sure what the notes say, but we'll never put a reason for an out-of-district placement in our voucher report. So there might have been confusion there, but it might just say there's a student ID, we don't use names, and where they're going. We, in general, all items that are qualified program by the Department of Ed can be submitted for reimbursement. So as long as it's a Department of Ed approved program, they have a process for that. Then they will, when we submit for circuit breaker, which we do at the end of every fiscal year, we list all of the students and their information and where they went. And based on that, the Department of Ed is able to evaluate what the program is, and then they would reimburse based off of the excess over the base rate, which is the same for every program. So,
So some of our vouchers just say out of district placement, and then some say per legal agreement. So
Mhm.
if a student has been placed out of the district by through the IEP process, are those are presumably reimbursed through the circuit breaker? Are legal agreements also reimbursed through the circuit breaker?
I believe it would just depend on the program, I think, or maybe it's just depend, I don't know, to be honest, but.
Likely no, because the legal agreement is typically a cost share of some sort.
Yeah.
So it would reduce it most likely below the circuit breaker.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Abby. I
No,
did
it's
not
okay.
send this one in advance.
No, and
so
I
did
was
get
trying
you
to
off
think of the
guard. I
answer, and I'm not
apologize.
sure I know, so
Yeah.
you probably have more experience than me, I apologize.
Does that circuit breaker reimbursement apply to transportation as well, or only to tuition?
It's a new change in the circuit breaker rules.
which we're gonna get to in the budget
Yeah, let's-
presentation, so let's
Sorry,
pause on.
there was some overlap.
Yes.
Yep,
But
there
yes,
is a
yeah.
little overlap,
Yeah.
but we do want to just
Yeah.
get through the, thank
But
you.
yes, it's the answer.
All right, anything else specific to these 2 vouchers or the minutes? Okay, all in favor of approving the consent agenda?
Yes.
Yes, that's unanimous. Motion carries. Back to the out-of-state travel. I will make a motion to approve the out-of-state travel as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, now discussion.
I'll just say I'm uncomfortable that we are taking on a liability for a program that might not have any connection to our educational program. And again, it's a might because we don't exactly know. And that we are not being proactive to families that might not be able to afford, that we're kind of waiting for them to speak up if they can afford it, which I'm not comfortable with.
I can understand that. I am not uncomfortable allowing this, like voting for this to move forward because they need to be able to plan and do that, but also I'm in support of learning more about this from, from the principal and that sort of thing.
So should
But
be here the first meeting in January. We can certainly put this on the list of things to discuss.
yeah, but also I think we need to take a vote for this to, to give her an idea of whether we're going to do that. Any other discussion? Okay, all in favor of approving the out-of-state travel as presented? All opposed?
One.
Motion carries. Thank you very much. And you'll note that.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Subcommittee reports. We'll get through this pretty quickly. Elementary facilities and MSBC, we have not met. The SBC has not met, but they are wrapping things up on time, on budget.
So
Did you want to?
for facilities, I think we wanted to note
Yeah.
on time, on budget, kind of cruising in to the end. And also, we did report out at our collaboration meeting, the state of our preparations for, field replacement.
Yep.
And it was going out to bid. So if you want to give a quick
Yeah, no,
synopsis of
just
where
that
we are.
we're on schedule. We got, and we're just making sure that our bid specification documents are good. We're getting a final legal review. We had our insurance company weigh in on, there's, typical levels of what they want to see in the documentation. So that should be going out within 1 to 2 weeks. And so we'll be, getting the results in so that we can make a recommendation in January. And I guess the only other thing to talk about, I don't know if we want to get into, there's a little bit of discussion about field usage split.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, that came up. And I think we sent the information some time ago to the facility subcommittee just to show that we had done an analysis of the usage split of the Brook Street field. As a reminder, the Brook Street field is in our regional agreement as a quote unquote shared use facility, which stipulates further that while the town will oversee usage, it's one of the things that we're responsible for maintenance of, but that we can charge back based a proportional charge based on usage, which is why you may remember in many conversations we've said there's an assumption that the town of Manchester would pick up a portion of that field. We didn't necessarily have a final sense of that, but we've been using rough terms of kind of 50-50. We did an analysis and that was done working between Jason Waldron, facilities manager, Cami Molinardi, athletic director, working with Cheryl Marshall, the rec department head for the town of Manchester, to just look at who's using the field when, and really in the spirit of trying to make sure we have a number that could be reasonably agreed to by everyone, given that it's a lot of money and obviously everyone wants the lowest number they can possibly get. What we saw was that the split is very close to 50-50 in two different ways. First, we look to see what's actually booked and reserved at a given time. And second, we look separately from that at who has the right of first refusal at a given time of day. So for example, during the school day, it's presumed that the town's not going to be renting it because we might be using it for recess. We don't use it every period or we're not there all day long. So on a usage basis, it would just be for the periods we're there. On a first right of refusal control basis, we would put in the whole day. And we did that analysis both different ways. The percentages were slightly different, but essentially very close to 50-50 in both cases. For example, in the summer, it's the town's right of refusal. They may not book it all day long, that's just one type of an example. So what we found is that the rec department was very comfortable with the numbers. They helped us to provide the inputs. We then also brought that information, the rec department Director Cheryl Marshall did tell us that she shared that with her committee. They didn't take any issue with that. We did bring it up at the recent collaboration meeting as well. We had shared that back with the facility subcommittee a couple months ago, I think, but we were just waiting to work it through with all the departments. So right now, it's looking like that's marching forward towards an understanding that roughly speaking, 50-50 is a good number, which is great news, I think, for the district's perspective. And I know people in both communities are wondering how that will work. Of course, the Highland Field, that's not that's not a shared use facility. It's 100% our use. We will pay for 100% of that field. So as we get into conversations about reserves and stabilization usage, et cetera, just keep those numbers in mind. In terms of next steps, once the bids come in, we will certainly let the school committee know what we learned. And those numbers for the Manchester side would clearly need to go to Manchester for them to do their funding that way through their town meeting process. Similarly, we would need the school committee to approve our part because it is not part of our operating budget, but rather coming through reserves that we have the right at school committee level to control, as long as you guys could vote that whenever you deemed appropriate. And we would want to have some agreement on that. I think from an order of operations, you may all remember, obviously the Highland Field has a much more of a near-term need in terms of condition. So it would be our plan and goal to get that done and approve that right away for the summer. I think we've also talked about the fact that 2 fields would be a significant use of reserves, and that given what we're talking about with the operating budget, it is probably worth it for us to continue to go through that process and, and discuss during budget season that timing before we just drop our reserve funds. Essentially what would be, let's just use rough numbers, 800,000 for one field, 400,000 for another, 1.2 million.
Let's reset the table for tonight. Bids are going out within the next 2 weeks. We'll get that information back, hopefully, to talk about at the beginning of the new year. And that will actually run in parallel with our budget discussion. So we'll be able to monitor potential commitments of reserves against what our budget operational needs are. Okay?
Pam's on a schedule, so we're gonna work with that. Thank you.
No problem. Any questions? Nope. Yeah.
Not on the field, but do we have an update on when we'll actually get the final Habib report on the 2 schools?
We met with them this week to go, page by page and just try to get all the details tightened up. We had originally asked them if they could have it for this coming week for the public hearing. It's going to take them a little bit more time to do that, but my goal is to get it done in December. So certainly in line with budget season, I think is still reasonable. So I appreciate your patience with that.
All right, thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Finance Subcommittee, briefly, we did, so I'll report on collaboration. We did have a collaboration meeting last Wednesday. We had our first collaboration meeting in person since I've served
I know.
on the committee, which was great. We're going to talk about most of what we covered there, but kept it at a high level first, kind of look at what's coming forward. Some things tonight are even a little different than that discussion, but also some general timing of the things coming up, so that we have both towns, board leaders on the same page with us about the timing for looking at EES, looking at the middle high school, looking at the roll off for the middle high school debt, all of those different things. So just a big picture look at those. And that multi-year look there. And we did talk about the field replacement as well. We did meet as a finance subcommittee yesterday briefly. We're going to cover it all tonight. Would you like to report on our subcommittee meeting?
No, go ahead.
We met yesterday and we're going to talk about everything from the meeting tonight. So policies, does anyone have questions? Say no.
No.
Policy subcommittee, Erica.
We did not have a chance to meet, and therefore we are going to wait on our second read until we've met again and approach that next meeting.
Right. Thank you very much. Negotiations?
Negotiations are ongoing, but I feel like we are making progress. We're getting there. Our next negotiations meeting is tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Superintendent's report.
Everyone's stolen a little piece of my thunder, so collaboration was a big deal. And obviously, for the past 2 weeks, we've been pretty buried in trying to make sense of the budget projections for next year. So a lot of time has gone into that. Diego was at the play on Friday night, so he did a great job. I mean, it was so upbeat and so fun, and the kids did a great job, and he did justice to it. So I don't need to retread that territory. I did report to you guys that the middle school green team is up and running and revived, and there's a nice article coming out about their project work. I just know in speaking with Joanne, she felt really happy for them. So we're starting to see a lot of things kind of coming back online and taking on energy that they had in the pre-COVID years. And then the high school green team did a great showing with their Planet Aid contest. They won a small grant, $500, but for such, I think the big deal is for such a small little area, they placed third regionally. So they did a really great job of collecting textiles and competing. I know they were competing in the spring and they fell just short. So I think that this was exciting for them. And then one thing just to note at Essex, what seems to be, I hope, a new tradition is the community read walkabout that they did on the day before Thanksgiving. That was just really well received. Each school does its traditional Thanksgiving celebration, but they added this piece in, and I know that the parents and the teachers and the kids really enjoyed it. So hats off to Essex for starting some new traditions. That's all I've got, unless there are questions or things that have come up. Okay.
Thank you. All right, continued business, fiscal year 24 tentative budget presentation. Take it away,
So I
folks.
think
Can I
yeah.
ask a question? Do you want us to be prepared to let you get through the whole presentation and then ask questions, or do you wish to go as we go along?
Can we take it in segments?
Yes.
Because I think the introduction is just making sure everybody understands the lingo. And this is just because what I am aware of coming into this is that we've done this discussion many, many, many times. So at some point, sometimes we're so deep into it, we don't realize that people aren't with us. So we planned a small introduction. If there are questions on kind of that structure and terminology, I think we break there. Then we get into the numbers and what we're seeing. Get through that, and then we can break there and then finish up with kind of big picture outlook.
Perfect.
So, and some of this may be familiar to you, so I'm not going to spend tons of time on it, but just so we're all on the same page, we're giving you an outlook tonight of where we think the FY24 budget's going to land, and it is months ahead of time before we have actual numbers. So most of what's baked into here are educated assumptions, right? So we have many years of following the trend. We have a sense of where things start and where they end in a given year, but anything can happen with some of these variables. So when you talk about things like out of district placement or healthcare, these are sound numbers today. They may not be sound numbers in March. So things will change. You made a great point. What we were talking about when we met at collaboration, we felt really good about. It changed by the next Tuesday. So we've got a handle on it today. What it looks like tomorrow may be different. In March it could change again. Basic budget structural principles. The 3.5 thing we're going to explain in a second, but basically we try to build the budget to support the program. But in a budgetary manner, we try to be stable and predictable for the town so that all the partners can plan. So our goal is never to come in at 10% one year, 2% the next, 15% the following year. We had a history of doing that in the early years of the district, and we worked very hard to be much more reliable and predictable. So we are striving for manageable numbers, and numbers, while they reflect reality, also take into consideration the known constraints of all of the people who need to carry the weight of the bill. So 3.5 is the number that has emerged as our target for any given year. That's not to say we're locked at 3.5. We can go below 3.5, and you'll see if you look on your budget spreadsheet, going back and looking at our total spending growth over the years, there have been several years we're in the high 2s, some years we're in the low 3s. In the COVID years, we are edging up over 4 and into 5. And in particular, this year, you're going to see that we're reaching close into the 6s because we're removing a source of revenue from the picture. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So 3.5 is our target going into any budget season. At this point in the year, we're always very comfortable at showing the number above that line, so we can explain where we may naturally be if we change nothing, and then walk people through over the month or two ahead as to how you're going to get down to 3.5, because sometimes it comes at a cost. couple of phrases we're going to use: spending growth, assessment growth, and apportionment. Apportionment is something that this group needs to be mindful of, but is not responsible for. Apportionment refers to the formula that divides the cost of spending that's passed on to the town between the two towns. So it's a formula that divides our annual growth number between the two towns, and that's where the enrollment conversation will come in a little later on. Apportionment isn't a real growth, it's a real growth number for the town based on what they spent the year before, but it isn't necessarily reflective directly of our growth in spending. And if we start to use the apportionment number to track our growth in spending, I think we're giving a skewed picture of how well the budget's being managed on the school side. And then the operational budget, again, level services is where we start. But level services shouldn't be looked at as a bad word, because we can do a lot within level services because it strives for stability. So the two things level services doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we don't invest in ourselves or improve the program or change things around or become more current. It also doesn't mean that we never cut anything, because a lot of times level services can be provided by making reductions or finding efficiencies in one area. Example of that last year was a reorganization of our psychological services, which allowed us to still meet the same guidelines of psychologist to student and provide some of the same level of service we did before, but because we are smaller now, we could do so with fewer people. Another example would be eliminating an elementary classroom from our program. Why do we do that? Because we can maintain class size with one less teacher, right? And we have our class size benchmarks to strive for. So those are a couple of examples of things that you can do to invest while living in level services, and things you can do to change things around, manage, or reinvest in yourselves by making cuts into level services. So those are kind of the basic underpinnings of the budget. Again, the key term, spending growth. That's our total operating cost year over year, right? So we spent $100 last year, and it's $150 that next year. The difference in spending, $50 from year to year. The assessment growth takes out, this one's trickier. The assessment growth, or the assessment number, is the amount of money, the bill, passed on to the towns after you back out all of the other revenue. So the other revenue, Chapter 70, state transportation, school choice, or other tuition we might have. And the big one that's being removed this year, reserve funds. So when we use reserves, they go in as an automatic deduction from the assessment pass forward. So when we talk about assessment growth, we're talking about the growth. Typically what it's really measuring is changes in other revenue streams, because when other external revenue is up, the assessment will come down. When other revenue declines, assessment number will go up. Okay, so that's the play that's being measured there. And then we talked a little bit about apportionment before. Once we figure out what our spending number is, once we figure out what amount of money gets passed to the town for payment, then you run that number through the apportionment formula, and they come up with how to split the bill at the end of the meal, so to speak. So those are the terms you'll hear us using again and again over the next couple of months. We talked a little bit about level services, and if there aren't any questions on kind of the keys, we're ready to dive in what we think it's going to look like for next year. So thoughts, comments, concerns at this point?
Okay, we're all good?
Good.
Love it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I throw one other thing in that came through in a question, and it was, if we're aiming at 3.5 and we already know our budget growth is over that, where does 2.5 come from? 2.5 is the reference to Prop 2.5. So the legal limit on the amount of taxes, taxes can go up in a given year without having a public vote on it. So you'll hear that come in terms of the different towns have different philosophies around how close or how far you should be to that 2.5 number. And there have been years when we've been asked, why can't we run at 2.5? We run this department at 2.5. Other towns run at 2.5. So the 2.5 is just a reference to the levy limit. And it's there as because we know we're asked often to try to get to that if at all possible. If we know we automatically grow at 3.5 or better, we know we're in an automatic cut situation to get there.
So before we move on, can I
Yep.
just make one comment on that?
Mhm.
So this will be my plug. If, for any of our members, if you are not already dialed into our individual and both our towns' finance situations, this is a good time to do that, to start paying attention to the finance committee meetings, paying attention to the board of selectmen meetings, because as Pam mentioned, there are different ways of looking at this. You've got the 2.5% limit, right? That Prop 2.5 limit, but also there's new growth and there's other revenue and different things. And each town has their own way of looking at it. So it is really on us to make sure that we're informed about what our towns are facing and how they choose to fund those things so that we can do our job here. So that's my plug.
I would just add from a formula standpoint, that the levy limit by statute is 2.5% of the prior year plus any development of properties known as new growth. So you add those two together for a town to figure out what their limitation is without having to have a separate vote for an override. And, although that number may turn into 3.5 to 4% in one community, say Manchester tends to be closer to the 3.5, 4% number. Philosophically, they may decide that they're sticking with 2.5 or whatever number based on their budget development process. And typically we see a slightly higher level of quote unquote new growth on top of the 2.5% in Manchester versus Essex. But that's a really important number to be aware of as well as you look at what the levy limit actually is.
Okay, thank you. You ready? All right. A little bit more background. So we didn't include these. I don't think we voted. I couldn't remember. I went through all the notes and I think the answer was we weren't going to include budget goals. But I took it upon myself to reintroduce, because these are things in our mind as we're planning the budget. So whether or not they're the official goals of the district, these are things we're trying to be mindful of when we start to build the budget. So I think fiscal responsibility is something we have taken very seriously over the years. We want to always be investing in our program and supporting our goals financially, but all goals don't have to have a financial price tag. And the only way to make forward progress isn't through money. So the budgets tend to be responsible, and we tend to try to find ways, we try to force the issue of reorganizing or finding a new way of doing something that may be outdated so we can invest in a new idea. So we put a little bit of pressure on ourselves internally to find ways in which to achieve goals that may take some investment dollars. One example would be when we started the EARL program, so the program for students with dyslexia. We seeded that through a community cooperation grant through the state and was able to receive funding to hire the first teacher and structure the first classroom. We used it as kind of 2 years of running revenue to support it. And then we were able to populate the program, avoid out-of-district placements, and the thing is paying for itself now. So those are the things we try to do without passing it directly back to the taxpayers, although there are times when we will have to do that. Managing enrollment, many of the, when we start to talk about, if we get put in a position to talk about cuts and program decisions, enrollment is the #1 driver. For all of the years I've been here, one of the most, if not the most important aspect of the program has been maintaining small class size, ensuring that students have access to a classroom that's, at the upper grades, 19 to 22 kids or 17 to 19 kids at the lower elementary. It's been very important. It still seemed to ring true as important when we did our strategic planning inquiries last year. So we're always trying to, and we'll manage enrollment up and downs based on class sizes. It's not pure at the high school, and we can talk about this later in the budget season. Very straightforward at the elementary for the most part, but at the high school you have specialty programs. French 4 class is never going to be 30 kids. It's probably going to be 10 to 12. At some point you need to make the call whether it's more important to continue the program and give kids access to the coursework they need to achieve their post-high school goals, or is it more important to save money? So we will typically err on the side of caution and make sure we have program access for the kids, but we will always be trying to fine tune to make sure that our faculty heads match the class size guideline needs. And then the other thing at play in enrollment that doesn't make it always pure, and you probably heard this more times than you can count now, is that over the years we've seen an increasingly diversified student body, whether it be ethnic and racial diversity or just student need, mental health issues. it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic anymore. It's a much broader program and set of services that we offer. So a lot of times, I think externally, it's easy to look at math, science, ELA and kind of say, well, you can make some class, why aren't you making more cuts in your program because your enrollment's going down? Where we're really needing to take general ed investments and then move them into specialty areas to ensure that we have the breadth of programming. So things we're doing to manage enrollment are watching numbers going up and down, but also watching different segments and populations within the district rise and fall and making sure they're appropriately staffed. We're gonna say fiscal responsibility one more time and finding self-investments, and then just trying to deal with some of the unfunded mandates that come our way. For a visual, budget's in two pieces: operating budget, which is mostly what we're going to talk about tonight. You'll get a capital budget update toward the end of the presentation. And basically, the majority of our budget are those two bottom boxes of required spending and preventative spending or common practices, and then the investments we try to do in a creative way. Yep.
Is it a good time to ask for your next section?
Yes,
okay.
it is.
Okay, so the budget goals.
Yeah.
In the first bullet, it says that is to also align with our multi-year budget goals.
Mhm.
What is our multi-year budget goals?
We have a multi-year model that Avi designed many years ago. And what we try to do is project and track. And once we have a contract locked in, it becomes much easier to do what our financial needs will be in the future. And also what our investments may be over time.
Has that been shared with school committee?
Mhm.
What's the so I haven't seen it. So is that something that you will share during this budget process so we can see how that align with the multi-year?
Yeah, it's an interactive tool. It doesn't set a commitment for multi-year. It helps us project and then
Yeah, sure.
make some decisions. Yeah, so it
I would
changes.
like to
I
see
know
that.
you,
And the second question is the school committee's class size guideline.
Yep.
Is that a set in stone, and how is that, the number of the students per class, how is that established? And then how is the class size compared to other towns? Is that are we pretty standard sized, compared to other towns? And
class size benchmarks pre-exist me. And they are a informal policy of the school committee. They're called benchmarks. We have it written down. I can pull up the sheet if you want. I don't know how they arrived at it. My assumption is they did a study of best practices at the time. The state does not set a minimum or a limit on class size, so it's up to each locality to determine it for themselves.
so,
And we would compare to other like districts of socioeconomic background.
but that was created many years ago.
Mhm.
So just wondering if it's time for another benchmark, just because a lot of things have changed since. So, because that does impact the budget size, right? The number of the teacher that we need.
And if we were to do that, that would be something we would do through our policy
Yeah.
work. That wouldn't be something.
Not this
that-
year, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, yeah,
At some point.
something to put on.
I would
the-
actually ask NASDAQ to do a comparable analysis for us. I think.
The final question on this page, the serve increasingly diverse student educational needs. So you mentioned about also not just the special needs, but also like different backgrounds and whatnot.
Yep.
How are we doing that? So the reason why I'm asked, to give you an example, I selfishly would like to see Chinese as one of the foreign language provided. Not just because my own personal background, but also because we are in a very white community.
Mhm.
So it's just something nice to have. And also it's more competitive compared to other schools because they are providing other languages other than Spanish and French.
Yep.
So how are we doing? That's including this budget.
I can do a quick one. At the secondary, we let student interest drive it, and I would say pre-COVID, I'm not sure the year, and Erica, I don't know if you had anyone at the high school at the time, they were looking into diversifying the world language program, and the interest was in bringing Mandarin online. I think they dabbled with some online options, but they didn't have enough student interest to propel it further. So typically at the secondary, it's driven by student interest. If we'd want to introduce it at the elementary, I would say it would be a project for the incoming curriculum director to do a broad assessment and interest survey on what we should be offering, what other schools offer and how they do it.
to follow up on what you're asking there, would it be correct to say that this would be something that if people were interested, that would be a good discussion for school council, to bring up at school council
I
for?
think it needs to be more systematic than
Okay.
a single school council. I think if you're looking at doing an overhaul of your K-12 world language program.
Yeah.
Then you want to take a look at what other programs are out there in similarly sized schools and how they're delivering them and what the breadth of the program looks like. I think a struggle for us is always going to be, we have big expectations, but our size can be confining at times. And that's where class size will come into play. Like if we could always offer independent studies or off school time exploratories for 2 or 3 kids who want something. And then become self-funded at that point, but then that's not the curriculum. So I think you start with, is it a curriculum question or is it an enrichment exploratory question? If it's a curriculum question, then it has to go through, there's a curriculum review cycle. When world language comes up, it becomes part of the conversation. So it's definitely worth exploring. I think we'll find there's a lot of different interests, right? You know, we've talked about Latin in the past. Be frank, we've talked about, there's a love of French, but is it serving a broad enough population to continue it? Or should we be looking to phase it out and bring in something that's more of a choice option, that's an online program and do a hybrid? So I mean, that's a year-long study, I think, in and of itself.
When the curriculum cycle brings it up.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
The other question, like, how have we diversified the program? I would say we went on a multi-year, strategy of converting traditional guidance support to higher level adjustment counselor and social worker credentialing so that they would be better equipped to deal with social, emotional, and mental health issues that our students are presenting with. We ensured that every school had a full-time adjustment counselor and that they can be some of the lead in supporting kids' emotional needs beyond the general classroom concept. So that's one area where we've done a lot of buildup. And also, I would say, we talked a lot about the special education in district investments. Those are all part of the diversification, meeting the needs of diverse students.
Thank you. Did you do this page?
I did.
Okay, can I ask a question then?
Yep.
Looking in the regional agreement, I was just trying to refresh my mind and just very, very briefly, operating budget versus capital budget has a different way to come up with the apportionment for those. Roughly speaking, does it end up being pretty similar or not at all? Because as we're talking about the budget for this year, I'm thinking ahead to what we're looking at down the pipeline.
Yep.
So it's roughly 67-33 for operating.
Yep.
I believe, I have the numbers right up, I believe it's closer to 64-36 for debt service, and I will get that number
Okay.
to you.
I just was curious.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's close, but not exactly, because the formula is a little bit
Sure,
different.
okay. So as our things shift a little bit, that may shift also.
Yes.
Okay, just for my
For
thought.
that 24 years, to give you a sense, I've just got it right here. It's actually looking at, when it's blended of all the different debt services, actually 59. Oh, that's the wrong number. I'll tell you when we get to
That's
that
right.
slide.
Yep. Got it.
But-
Yes, Erica.
Got it.
67.
The term managing enrollment, I think I'm understanding that slightly differently than what you mean. I understand the sub bullets that you have on there.
Yep.
But I was just wondering, is there a budget goal associated with enrollment in terms of, one thing we're seeing is obviously the more students we lose, the more constraints we have on the budget. Is there actually a budget goal associated with that? Kind of trying to stem the tide away?
So the enrollment decline is demographic. So unless we can bring more people into town, aside from looking at the private school enrollment,
Yeah.
which has been relatively steady with some spikes that the high school is currently studying from the 8th to 9th grade. That's not our enrollment decline. It's contributing maybe 10, 20 kids, but our enrollment decline is from the 20%. We had 20% spike right around the 2010 to 14 time period, which took our historic 1250 to 1300 student population and spiked it over 1500 students. Okay, so we had an influx of new families, new students coming into school. through that time, our out of district, our private school numbers ran, probably about the same. What we're seeing now is this bubble that came in and caused the spike is now pushing its way. It's out of the middle school and pushing to the end of the high school. That's the big drop. That's I mean, we were going back through old charts. I had a chart that said our growth was the equivalent of the size of Essex Elementary School. So in that period, we added like one whole school to our district. We've now exited that whole school. It hasn't gone out quick. It's gone out little by little. And every year you can kind of, if we go back through the budgets, you'll see, the attrition cuts that were made. So nobody was losing anything, but we were retiring out people and not replacing them in general ed roles. So things like consolidating librarians. So when we had a 1.0 librarian retirement, we went to a shared one. We could do that because of enrollment. When we had a 1.0 technology retirement, we went to a shared model at the elementary schools because we could do so because of enrollment. We phased out 3 classrooms at Memorial School. So those are kind of how we were dealing with the beginning part of it. Middle school is a little different. Middle school, we can't manage enrollment well. The physical constraints of the building forced them to have to deal with some very large class sizes. So they went up to 28, 29 during the bubble, and now they're coming back down. And I think they're right around low end of benchmark, about 99 kids per class. High school is still the largest group. They're about 475. They're going to dip down a little bit more next year as the bigger classes exit out. So what you'll see is ability to make a few more reductions once the bubble starts exiting the high school, because the middle school is a little bit stuck because of its model. So I think we have the demographics, and then we have more of the trying to figure out why people and families are choosing other options, if it's available to them, and solving that. And I think that's a different solve, I think, than the pure budget discussion.
Sorry, just one last question on enrollment. I think you answered this last year, but I forgot the answer. How and when do you know approximately, like, incoming K class? I forgot how and when.
We ballpark it on the census,
Okay.
and then we start to do enrollment in February. January, thank you, Maria. So we have it by February. That's the one. Anything else on the enrollment? Did that get at what you were thinking about, or no?
It did. It got to more than what I was thinking about. I was thinking about continuing to try to keep an eye on the private school exodus, because I do think that has a financial impact. And I think it can lead to a further financial impact that can also impact apportionment.
Yes.
So I don't want to lose sight of that. Because I think if we do, we could see a bigger apportionment next year and a bigger the next year, and all that comes back to the budget. So I recognize that we need to continue moving along, and we should, but I do.
I don't
see them
disagree
as
with that.
linked.
I see them as linked. I think the solutions are in different areas. We can talk more about apportionment
Yeah,
and the
we
role
can
of
reconcile
enrollment,
tonight.
and I think we don't have them tonight. We can bring them and we'll have them at, well, I can dig them out. If you look at, let me put a pin on, I think we need to talk about apportionment in reality and apportionment in political perception. Because if we flip the calendar back 6 years, this conversation was being had in reverse. And it is and if you go back another 5 years, Essex was in this position then as well, where they were receiving the higher end of apportionments. It's cyclical. It's going to continue to happen. We need to own our piece of it, but there are certain things that are a little bit beyond our control. We can try to adjust for 10 or 15 heads in private school placement, but that's existed throughout. And I don't think we're talking about 280 kid difference. We're not going to solve it. That's a piece of it, but that's not the ultimate solution to it. It's just part of where the communities are, and are people moving into the communities and accessing the schools. So tentative budget overview, and then Avi can run you through some numbers. So carry forward, we talked a little bit about that, the strategic priorities, right sizing for enrollment. I think I've covered most of these. The big piece this year is, look, for right sizing for enrollment, let me go back and say I didn't hit this technical piece.
Yeah.
We are assuming a reduction of 4 FTEs, undesignated at this point in time. They could be through attrition if if they work out in a positive way. But we think with where we see enrollment now and where we see program, we won't know for certain until February or March when we start to build schedules, but we think we can absorb a reduction of 4 people. That's, in the $200,000 plus reduction ballpark. And then the budget does not include reserves. So when you see, that we pulled $500,000 of other revenue out of the budget. So that is going to drive up the assessment percentage for next year for the towns. And then even after doing all that, there's still a gap of 756,000 between spending and revenue, which we're going to have to figure out how to address, and that's where the conversation about correction comes in.
And just to clarify that point, that would be between spending and like our typical 3.5 year where we're not assuming there's a deficit. So that's the gap down to 3.5%.
And then just to be clear, we're not including any reinstatements. So there are still lines that aren't fully funded in the budget. There are positions that we haven't even discussed putting back in. Small things like the service of after-school bus, late bus, oh my gosh. The late bus, it's small, it's $25,000. It's not in there though. So we have to talk about or think about, do you want us to go and build those things into the budget? That will pull that number up. Stabilization contribution. Stabilization got flooded when we did the memorial school. When we took out the loan, the interest of the loan went straight into a stabilization fund. First priority for those funds were to be capital investments for parity at Essex Elementary. So all of the new tech to make sure their tech was on par with Memorial came from that fund. That fund is now dwindling down. We'll get another infusion when we do the Essex Elementary School, but between now and then, that's the fund we would look first to if we need the boiler, if we need, to patch the roof while we're trying to figure out the timeline for Essex Elementary. Those are funds that we need. We also would want to have those funds and start to plan to build up those funds to address issues that will pop up at the middle high school as it starts to age a little bit. It's hard to think about it as old, it's not, but, carpets wear out and tiles need to be replaced. So there are small investments we'll need to make along the way. We want to discuss whether or not we should build in. We had one at one point. It goes away really quick when you're looking for cuts, but a line item dedicated to putting money into a dedicated stabilization fund for capital investments every year. And then reserve replenishment. Again, not endorsing any of these, just telling you what we haven't included, but we should talk about is, do we want to put in an amount of money to be dedicated to replacing the amount of reserves we have used over the past few years to manage the operating budget? We wouldn't have that number tonight. We need to certify some other end of year. We need to certify those, the E&D, but we could certainly come up with a formula to estimate what that would be. Again, not endorsing, just saying these are some things we need to think about. Yep.
Question in the previous page, the 4 FTE cut.
Mhm.
So those, what you're saying is it's gonna be reduction, including the natural attrition. But if there's no natural attrition, there will be actually specific work FTE cuts.
Yes.
And would that be within the core curriculum teacher FTE, or would it be like the enrichment, however you call it, in that category?
Probably the core.
Really?
Mhm.
And that's because the reduction in classes, or the enrollment, I should
Like
say.
we may only need, I'm afraid to even make an
Yeah.
example. Let's say we offered, give me a bookmaking.
Widgets, yes.
Okay, we offer 5 sections of bookmaking. Well, we can still offer, we have enough, we only need 3 sections because that's all that the students enrolled for. You have fewer students, it's still a popular course, but we can do it with a 0.6 instead of a 1.0. So we could take a reduction.
Got it.
It would have no impact on the service delivery. It's just a natural way of reducing. Okay. Now the numbers. Avi.
Well,
You need
I think this is just, I'm just looking up here. This is really more some of the overview that Pam's already provided.
Avi, can
So-
you speak up a little bit?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me any better now?
Yeah. thanks.
Okay, I apologize. So, this is really just more of the overview that Pam's already gone through, so I think I just get more closer into the numbers. So what's going on with the gap? What are some of the biggest items? Well, health insurance is really the biggest large cost driver that's currently in the tentative budget model, primarily because our number one cost in terms of pie chart, where the money goes, being personnel. I think with this 4 FTE reduction, it takes what might normally be right around a high 3, low 4% level services number that we typically see. It's bringing it down to 2.8%. So when you look at the total personnel and the total operating expenses, the personnel line's growing 2.8%. That's definitely straight off of the fact that we have those 4 FTE reductions. So as a result, that number really isn't a major driver of what's leading to this deficit gap that we're talking about, although it is a big percentage of total spending. So in some ways it is. But the kind of abnormal growth that's certainly well above a level services trend line and a Proposition 2.5 type of trend line is the health insurance, where we've got a 12% rate growth assumption in there based on what we're hearing, and we'll talk more about that. Out of district spending has been a number that we've been talking about in the past 2 budget cycles. It's typically been, in the 3 or 4% of total spending, not a big number, but a certain number of placement changes could certainly lead to atypical growth in a given year. And what we saw in the fiscal 22 and 23 budget cycles was exactly that, where we had, as the in-district programs have continued to succeed, serving more kids, what's left are, for who needs to go out, are kids who might have higher needs than we can service in district, for whom a cohort in a program might not be able to be built. And so that led to, higher rates per pupil who are going out. And that's what we saw in the past 2 years. We're still seeing that cost trajectory is there. But from a budget standpoint, when you look at the budget row, you'll see it's actually a negative impacted budget once you account for the circuit breaker. So yes, the baseline number is growing by about $300,000. And the major driver there, which we've previewed in some of our other conversations, is the Commonwealth did approve through its Operational Services Division, OSD, the group that sets the private school placement rates that are approved and acknowledged by the circuit breaker program, et cetera, a 14% inflationary growth for fiscal 24. It's a major shock to just about every public school district across the state. And there's certainly a lot of legislative conversations that are happening, but at this point, it's certainly our understanding that there's no magic amount of money that's going to be given to us to offset that, other than the fact that it will eventually impact circuit breaker in the subsequent.
Good.
So those are some of the high level trends. Just digging into the major cost areas, compensation, personnel. The 517,000 is 2.8% dollar growth. And here are some of the major pieces that are in there that I think are typical for people to want to make sure they understand well. So we've broken down the personnel into teachers, teaching assistants, all other staff, as well as FTE. So the first 3 bullets are really about rate, and the last one's about quantity. Quantity times rate is your total spend. So we've already addressed the last bullet there, the 4.0 FTE reduction. On the top 3, we know that we're in the middle of negotiating a contract. And so we don't have a contract yet for fiscal 24. So that's why we're doing our best to put a number in there that's representative of where we've been, which is certainly we would be obligated for all the step increases and column moves that are on the current grid. That survives because it's already a printed approved contract. So that aspect of the contract is in place. There is no guarantee of what a COLA would be on top of that, which would change each cell. But given that the past 4-year contracts have been at 2.5% level, we have that in the budget now because we certainly think that that's a reasonable estimation at this point in time. Certainly, as we get more updates from that process, there could be news there. But given that we are already operating in deficit land right now, I think something north of that kind of 4-year traditional spend would need to come out of some other area of the budget, I would imagine, rather than just grow the deficit. That would be my guess, but that's really all for the school committee to decide as they consider that process. So really, there isn't a lot of news there. That's a fairly, I would say, standard set of numbers based on what we've seen in prior years. The teaching assistants, we just breaking them out just to let you know, it's about 40 FTE, and they do get steps. About 77% of them are already on the max step, which is step 4. So for them, that 2.5% COLA is 2.5%. But when you factor in the fact that a bunch of step 1, 2, and 3 people, the 23% of the total FTE are moving through steps, you get a blended rate of about 4.2% growth. Very similar to what we've seen with the teachers within a couple of basis points. All their staff, there are no steps available. Those staff have been tracking at 2.5% consistently with no steps. And so we've definitely seen a divergence there over certainly the past 4 years and even before. So we've got a 4% assumption in there, which is really in line with our typical personnel level services growth number, which kind of tries to stop the divergence that really becomes problematic at some point if not addressed on a multi-year basis. So it's kind of a catch up from several years of having done really nothing. So that's the personnel compensation side. I talked a little bit about insurance. Basically, first question we've been asking our broker is, hey, it's an inflationary market. What does that mean for rates? What are you seeing? Typically, we've talked in the past about 6 to 8% is the typical cost growth that you see. If your utilization is about the average, and then if you're having a good year for utilization, then you might be a little below that. If you're having more use of the program, large losses, for example, heavy cases, you might be north. So that 6 to 8% range we're hearing is closer to the 8 to 12 range because of some of the market inflation that we're seeing across multiple areas. And we're budgeting conservatively at the top end of that range. Currently, our utilization, is looking solid. I would say solid. I don't want to get too optimistic about it, but we have years where we're entering here where we're saying we're running low or running high. I would say we're running well. Incrementally, I'm slightly optimistic that this number could come down, but I think what we typically do is we just get month by month of additional claims data and look at that. And, there's basic utilization and then there's the large losses. We're a little high on the large losses. Those could be, take us in the opposite direction. The basic utilization seems to be doing better. So I'm just going to provide updates as I get more information. I think this is, based on what our brokers told us, is a good conservative starting place. So I would start with that. And
I'll just flag this one as one that can go up and down, depending on how things start to come together over the next few months. It makes me, this one makes me nervous because it's we don't know with certainty until late. So
that's the big number. And I guess I would just say, if you're thinking about level service budgeting and how we handle our assessment to towns and what's affordable for them and for us by contrast, right off the bat, when your number 2 cost is growing at 6 to 8% in a good year or 8 to 12, clearly that's well north, even though it's about 20% of our total spending of the 3.5 target. So every year, this is a number that is just systemically going to require savings in other areas. So just keep that in mind. And I think clearly at a 12% level, it's quite a bit higher.
Mhm.
So this, of all the things that are causing a deficit right now, this is the one that I think is number 1. And we'll see how we do as 4 months come in. So moving along to out of district, I talked about how the baseline growth, $300,000 for students who are resident students. We don't, so that number is 13% growth. Now, it's very similar to the 14% growth number that you saw. In fact, we have some kids who are not in private school placements. They might be in other public school programs. They might be in collaborative programs. A collaborative organization is a regional organization that provides services to all the districts in the catchment area. They have some programs that we use too. So that's why the blended rate works out closer to 13%. I guess I'll just hit to the punchline first. Because circuit breaker is starting to come back to us as we've had more and more of these high-cost placements. What we saw in 22 and 23 is starting to turn into circuit breaker revenue, which then should be used to offset our out of district in a given year. So whereas we were having circuit breaker reimbursements 2 years ago of about $310,000, it bumped up to the mid 500,000s and now moving up to the mid $700,000 for the most recent preliminary numbers that were targeted to get this year for last year's expenses. Remember, it's always a year lag. But that number finally is starting to catch up. And so that's why we're able to lower the budget, because the amount of growth in circuit breaker is greater than the amount of growth in that 300,000 spent. Erica asked a question earlier about how does transportation impact the circuit breaker program? Because transportation has been growing like crazy and has been kind of ignored for so many years, there was a major outcry from a lot of districts, and as part of the Student Opportunity Act a couple of years ago, the DESE agreed to start factoring that in on a 4-year phase-in basis. 25% of transportation costs for out of district would be eligible in year 1, then 50, then 75, then 100. So this is a budget year where we're going to be looking for a 75% eligibility, and they layer that on top of the tuition and see how much that total is above the threshold that is considered our obligation. It's around $45,000 is what we owe. Everything above that would be potentially eligible. So that's good news, and that definitely is starting to be one. That's another factor for why our circuit breaker is really starting to come back and accelerate a little bit right now. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything else. I mean, from a cost perspective, the out-of-district transportation costs as a cost driver is still significant. You remember we had a major budget transfer into the current year. We talked about it last year, how it's been up. It's 145% up over 3 years. So it's kind of shocking. And, you know, it leads a lot of districts to look at things like, oh, should we be insourcing or whatever? The reason it's going up is because there aren't drivers available. And so there's money chasing drivers. And so, you know, my kind of old life entrepreneurial mindset is, if you want to be in that business, you're in the recruiting drivers business. That's what it is. And just to be super clear, you need to have not just the driver for each route, but a backup driver, because if your driver calls in sick, you have to deliver that route or you have a major compliance issue on your hands. So you have to have a stable of drivers ready to go, and you're constantly you have to have a specialized skill of being a recruiter. So that's why I think in general, certain services really are outsourced because of the specialization around that process, around advertising, you know, training, all those types of things. And there are quite a bit of compliance requirements around drivers. So as much as I'd like to say this is crazy, we're getting gouged, so to speak, could we do it? I think the truth is it would be a very complex operation and it would be fraught. And we're in very bad company, good company of other districts that are facing this exact problem. I think the only silver lining is that it's being picked up increasingly by circuit breaker. Other than that, I don't really have good news to share. All right, big numbers. How big is our budget? $30.1 million. That's a 4.21% spending increase. So that's $1.22 million. So when we talk, you know, spending, then assessment, then apportionment, spending 4.21% increase. It's right around our level services target. I do think that with a 12% health insurance number, that's one reason why it's a little north of 4%. You know, I think last year I'd have to look back. I think the total number of growth for 23 was 3.56%. You know, it's a little higher. If the health insurance number comes in, I think we would see, you know, a lower number there. I think we ended the budget cycle last year, I believe, at 10% for health insurance, and before that, it's really lower. You can see the differences, the 2.8 for personnel and the 6.6 for operating, which, as I mentioned, is heavily influenced by health insurance. What does that mean for assessment? It's a 6.53% assessment number. Just by contrast, last year, 2.89, the year before that, 3.5, the year before that, 3.18, before that, 2.85. We've shown you that chart where it's really a tight number in the 2 to 3 range. Even if we have a target of 3.5, as Pam mentioned, we often get requests from towns. Can you help us this year? Can you use some of your reserves, which then put in money that doesn't have to be town money and suppress the town assessment. Why are we at 6.53%? Because we've taken $520,000 of revenue out of the budget. We've been talking for many years using this multi-year budgeting concept that Anna and Pam were just asking about before. That multi-year budgeting tool allows us to say, when we're using one-time funds for our revenue, and we know that that's not sustainable, what does that look like over time? So we've been talking about making this change now for 2 to 3 years, where we've said this would be the budget cycle where we pull those reserves out and ask the towns to do essentially a one-time lasting adjustment where they, for this year, go above that 3.5% target to a number where they are assuming, where we're not suppressing their costs anymore through one-time monies. So that's really, if you took that out alone, you'd be at a number closer to 4.45%, I think was my analysis I put in the memo. And the only reason that's still above 3.5 is because we've still got a cost rate of about 4.21. So we'd be in spitting distance of that target. So that's how we get to 6.53%. Again, the assessment is spending after deducting revenue that comes from other sources like state aid, et cetera. This is that $413,000 decline, of which 520 is coming out. It's a little less than the 520 decline net because we have an increase of a little over $100,000 for the Chapter 70 program based on last year's minimum per pupil increase of $60 per student. Even when your enrollment's going down, the state has started a program a couple of years now where they give you a minimum aid per pupil of growth of new money.
Question. Yep. Well, hold on, are we getting to a certain break point here? Because I want to follow with what we had sort of
I
gone
think I
to.
could probably hit the slide and then hit it, and then we can go. Is
Great.
that okay?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because I
so
think
just
we
to finish on this
probably all
slide,
have some.
the other state aid item that we get is transportation aid. We had $357,000, a big spike in fiscal 22. Remember that was over budget. We put the excess like we have for many years into the 1-year rollover, transportation revolving. But part of the reason that was higher is because first, we've done route consolidation, so we have lower costs. And B, we also had during the COVID years and even into, in 22 revenues based off 21 costs. In 21, we had no students riding who were in the pay zone of less than 1.5 miles. So it was all reimbursable costs. So we've known that that's been an anomaly in terms of what we receive, even though we sometimes have excess. That is not something we should be considering. And we, when we submitted our costs for 22, it went back to showing a portion that was reimbursable and a portion that was non-reimbursable. So that's why we kept the budget assumption in line with the 23 budget at $275,000. And then the last one, we don't have any choice assumptions. Sometimes we'll change that during the budget of increasing or decreasing the number of school choice kids, but that always exists as an offset to the budget. So questions?
Okay, so we have questions. Anybody? I know I do. Anna, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. On the revenue, the decrease of 13,000, big part of it is the not use of the reserve.
Yep.
So the question is, you talk about, you guys have a multi-year plan, multi-year budget, I should say. Is your multi-year budget including not using the reserve for the future multi-years, 0 every year? Or is it like some kind of reduction from the previous 520, 350, 335, whatever that might be?
So 2 questions. You do the technical, I'll do the political. Yeah, after the premise of the last override was to not use reserves in the budget as operating dollars. We went through till 2020 when we had a request from one of the towns to, after we closed the budget, lower the assessment because they had some unexpected costs. We had great debate at school committee that if we used reserves to do that, we were starting down the road of what we said we would never do again. And that the first 100 seems small, but it will escalate every year just to keep pace. And that's what happened, and that's where we are now. So philosophically, best practice, we don't have a model that includes reserves. We have a model that allows us to toy with everything that he's built, and you can kind of talk about what the principles are behind it, but our intent is never to use reserves. But we started as a way of assisting one of our collaborative partners, and now we're kind of we're kind of stuck, and we need to figure out a way to move forward from it. If that answers your question. It's not an intentional strategy on our part.
So the answer is zero, because we don't budget to use the reserves.
Yeah, and that's the technical answer to be honest.
Yeah.
So, because I think it's just a question of what we want to do. We use the multi-year tool not to say, here's where the budget's gonna be in 3 years. It's more to say, here's what level services growth rate looks like. Here's what we assume for non-town revenues, which is very minimal growth. And so here's what that does to assessments. And so here's what assessments would look like. And if we want to hit 3.5% as that target, either you've got to have a bigger one-time adjustment in this current year. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to want to talk about in the coming years is this is just to close a single year gap. But what are we going to do for the out years? And I think to close those out years, yes, the number would need to go up from 756,000. This is just a single year number. And I think everyone understands that we don't want to just have an adjustment this year and be right back where we were next year. So that's an open item that I think school committee needs to tackle in the budgeting process.
Right. I have a question and then we'll go to Matt. We'll go right around. We'll just go right around. How's
Okay.
that? It's the same question. I feel like I asked repeatedly, but this is a cost and a revenue question about OPEB.
Yeah.
It's a big commitment that we
Yeah.
have to make our OPEB contribution each year wisely. We are well funded due to your expertise over many years, which is great. But at what point, when do we accomplish an analysis to know at what point we can start drawing from that? Because retiree healthcare is becoming an increasingly larger cost for us, which we never know.
So there's the actuarial answer, and then there's also a more kind of real politic answer, and I would just say, what?
No, Peg can handle that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the actuarial analysis is that part of what you're setting aside money for is not just your cost growth, but also your existing balance sheet liability. And that's how the pension organizations are required to do things. And as they go on their path to full funding and they increase their pension charge, remember, teachers, no pension obligation for us, just for non-teaching staff. Those numbers are growing around 7% in terms of the charges per year without a use of those funds. They're trying to build back to a quote unquote full funding. So on that model, it would be, 25 years
Okay.
on an actuarial basis. On a realistic basis, we are seeing some things that have potential to bend the cost curve. We've certainly seen that legacy 80/20 plan dwindling significantly as a percent. We're seeing that the Medicare supplement plan, which is now by far the predominant cost, which is a much lower cost per plan, taking over. And so even though our number of heads is growing and the cost has been growing, we're starting to see a little bit of a bend in that curve. And so I think we could start to think practically about whether we accelerate the use of some of those funds to pay current year retiree health costs. In all cases, just to be super clear,
Right.
it would be used for retiree healthcare,
Yeah.
but it could offset the budget, just like circuit breaker
Right.
offsets the out-of-district spending, because that's what it's set aside for, as opposed to just building the bank account and growing the balance. Does that answer your question?
It does, but we still don't really have like a policy. My concern
Yeah.
with that is that we end up with a changing, committee over time and based on, how things are going in a year. So I guess I'm just putting it out there.
Yep, and I think it's out there, so maybe it's not a political response, I should say it's more the relationship
Yeah.
answer, which is one of the catalysts behind coming up with OPEB was a commitment and, a push from town of Manchester to be thoughtful and plan for the long-term liability and not set it up so that it's just a humongous override somewhere down the line. So kind of going back to that last override year, one of the agreements before we went for the override was that we would get the OPEB issue squared away.
Yeah.
So one relationship was with town of Manchester and what they felt was practice they were undertaking, Essex was starting to undertake it at the same time. So collaboratively, we felt it was all in everyone's best interest to do it. The other partner in that is the Teachers Association, who was willing to renegotiate their healthcare plan and help us come up with a mechanism for funding retiree health, so that retiree health would never be the cause of reductions in staff or reductions in program down the line. So I think we might be at a point where we start to have that conversation. I don't want to be premature with a recommendation, but I would say we want to be careful and ensure that not only does it go to retiree health, but it goes to helping support our program and our goals and not just continue to suppress the assessment. I think it's a difficult spot to be in when we continue to, unless we come up with an E&D flat rate that needs to go in every year to take the edge off of assessment, and it's beneficial to whichever town is in a difficult position with the apportionment formula. I think we need to be mindful of what its intended use was. Kate.
Could you just, for clarity, state what is the other side of reserves? So, right, we said we are not using reserves for the operating budget because that's the best practice. So what are we using reserves for?
One-time capital investments, and that can come in a lot of forms. Maybe it's buying a new textbook series, maybe it's computers. Most likely it's going to be facilities. Biggest facility project we have coming up is the 1.2 million commitment to the turf field replacements, which is going to half our current reserve pool. The rest of it should be left and built up to support any oh my gods from middle high school or Essex over the next few
Right,
years.
that's not even what I thought you were going to say when you said our biggest.
In our third, I
Capital
think the
project.
third bullet, the largest capital project is the school replacement.
Right.
And I think what we learned in the last go around is that healthy reserves, not just the number like we talked about yesterday, but the practices in using them
Yeah.
contribute to getting better lending rates. So we want to have good practice in place. And I think whether it's 5% or 10%, it's debatable what makes reserves healthy. Using them to fund your
Right.
operating isn't a good sign. So making sure those are stabilized and that we have a plan for replenishment when we go out to borrow for Essex, which could be 18 to 24 months, 36 months. That's kind of the third leg of the stool. Is that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry if this is redundant of Anna's question. I couldn't actually hear all of it. So I want to just understand. Right now, we're looking at 6.53% once we remove reserve funding. Is it accurate to say that although the towns would like us to stay at around 3.5% growth, in fact, 6.5% is how we realistically grow and expect to continue growing if we want to stick with level funding and not use our reserves?
Just for this only year,
Why
because,
only this year?
because you're taking, so let's just say you plug that $523,000 hole with fresh town funding. Then on any given year, your assessment is gonna grow right around the level of your spending growth with a small differential for what's happening for state aid, which is our other revenue source. So if you have spending here and revenue here, if this is growing, let's just say 3.5%, your revenue needs to grow 3.5%. And your revenue sources, when you're not using reserves, are gonna be town and it's pretty much state aid. State aid might be growing closer to 1.8 or 2% every year, so maybe a 3.5% spending growth means the town number, instead of being 3.5 spending, might be 3.7 or 3.8 for the towns, because the state portion is growing a little slower. But basically, that's it. We have a one-time massive reduction in the fiscal 24 budget of revenue, which is our revenue from our reserves. After that, assessment and spending should grow very similarly. And that's been historically the case when you're not mixing in reserves.
It's because it's a catch-up. The increase, we're reporting an increase over last year, but their increase is over past years where they haven't paid the natural growth rate, and it's been subsidized through the reserves. So they've got a big jump. It's like getting the big raise, you reset the bar, but your raise next year will be 3.5% on whatever that baseline is.
It seems like we should and I'm sure this is your intent, but looking at this and thinking ahead is really trying to make sure whatever we ask for, and I think you've recognized this in the presentation, but not put ourselves in this perpetual cycle where we're constantly trying to go back.
And I think there's interesting conversation that takes place with the town partners, which is Greg Federspiel has always been one to ask the question. I think it's a good one. Do you go for these big overrides? You know, you go 8, 10 years and you create these catch-ups and then build forwards? Or do you just understand that every couple of years, you might need to go up to 4.5% to make sure we're making stable progress forward and take it in little smaller chunks so it's more palatable.
Yep.
I think from our perspective, that's a town, how the towns prefer to manage that. It doesn't, it impacts us in the bottom line. I think our goal, that's why it's built into the strategic plan, is we will be, if we can get to stability, no, if 3.5 is the number, it may not be our ideal number, but if we can at least guarantee that, then we know how to plan and maneuver and use the multi-year tool to figure out, these are all of our objectives, and here's the game plan of how we would have to do that. If we're not rolling up on every year, and every time it looks like we might be able to come under, we have to make a reduction, you know, so the stable funding would do wonders for us in terms of long-term planning and probably staving off large overrides. If that makes sense.
Right around.
I'm just saying, based on the OPEB curves, that's we're bending cost curves and not COVID curves.
I like it.
How many years is the bus contract and what year are we in?
I need to get the answer to that. I believe this is going to be year 3 of a 5-year contract.
Okay. Well, the scary part comes in.
Yeah.
And similarly, utilities concerns for.
Yep, and so we didn't really get into all the cost categories, but that is a big increase in the budget too. If you look at the categories, maintenance is one of the ones that's growing more significantly. We had 100 and I think $87,000 or $78,000 transfer into the current year budget to pay for a most of the year catch up for the new rates that are reflective of the war in Ukraine and the global inflationary market and the energy crisis. So we do have a continued bump up into 24 to assume a full year. I am looking to fine tune those numbers in the coming weeks, working with Power Options, who's been our advisor, to see what they see. They helped us to get the 23 numbers down. We have some more work to do. Part of that holdup is we're waiting for National Grid, which has been gave us estimated numbers for 22. That is our baseline for our projections, and they're getting around to truing up the estimated to actual, which is, by the way, why we also, you may have seen on some of our vouchers, had some delays in when we normally pay our bills for utilities in fiscal 22 and 23. So it is a number, it is a factor, it is why that category is growing. And if you look at the maintenance and transportation, it's got a 6.7% growth rate for the non-personnel side. The personnel is 2.9%. And it's primarily utilities. The other small portion that's increasing is continued bringing the 24 budget in line with most recent actuals for investment at Essex Elementary and high school to a lesser extent, just continued maintenance as, you know, the Essex Elementary building is older. It just costs more to maintain. So, and obviously that's been offset by very good savings at Memorial, which is a brand new building and, you know, is not requiring a whole lot of maintenance right now.
Thank you.
Anna?
Yes.
Yeah.
So if I'm getting this right, the $1.6 million increase in the operating assessment after excluding the 3.5%, then that's where we get the 756.
Correct.
Okay. For the 756K, if you apply the apportionment formula, what is the split between Manchester and Essex?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's the same.
67-33.
Oh, because 1/3, 2/3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you're asking me a different question. it basically would be about the same of what we're estimating in this budget, which we put out there in our
So
preliminary
it's,
number.
show them the line that they can
60,
see.
yeah. So,
Here, I can fill this one up.
so what we did is run a preliminary apportionment, based on the data that we have and showing, about 63% for Manchester, 37% from Essex. The current year budget's about 64%. So, and
Oh, I
it
see.
was, yeah, and it was around, just to get to that basis point, 64.6 in 19, down to 64.2 in 22, 63.7 in 23, and we're forecasting right now 62.96 for Manchester. So Essex has popped up to 37% from about 35.4%.
So Essex is only about 280K. And Manchester's difference. Okay. Another question. So process-wise, we're not gonna see the detail of that, the budget layout with the different, the
Oh,
line
pages.
items till like end of January, early February.
Earlier, mid-January.
Mid-January?
Yeah, one of the first or second meeting of the new year is when we roll out that whole budget and take all this and dump it into that template.
For the next week's public hearing.
Yeah.
What kind of feedback are you expecting? Because you're gonna present something similar, right?
Yeah, from community members, really, it's just, go ahead, Pam.
I think that's what we're gonna talk about here tonight
Yeah.
with what the committee wants to hear
Yeah.
from the public to help them make their decisions.
So is this an okay transition point for discussion, or do you have some more slides that you want?
I think he wants to take you through just a quick hit on the reserves and then the capital.
Yep, okay.
Now, if I can find that file again.
Great, thank you. So this is the reserve update that we provided in September based on our estimate of how fiscal 22 is closing. I mean, just to hit the bottom line, we're looking to end fiscal 22 right around 3.1. What are we waiting for? The Department of Revenue has to certify our excess and deficiency fund. It's around just under 11% of the budget. And we also showed you in the next slide, what we know already is going to be happening, with this year as we continue to spend down the stabilization fund, which had gotten as high as right around $970,000 from the memorial proceeds. With some of the items that the school committee has approved for the security equalization, we know we're working on the Habib report is going to be a cost there, and also the Gale Associates design contract for the turf field replacement. Those are all coming out of stabilization. Those are the current projects that essentially will take that money very close down to zero by the end of this year. That's how we get to $2.8 million heading into 24. And these are the major obligations that we've talked about previously. And so this isn't really new information, but it is certainly important as we consider why we have reserve funds, what we need to do with them, and how much of them will be depleted just by using them for what they're meant to be used for. That's where if you take out some of those items, you're looking at that last bullet of the recurring operating deficit. It does not really make a whole lot of sense financially to be continuing down the path we're in. That's why I started raising my concerns about 2 years ago through that multi-year budgeting process, just so everyone was aware. We know we don't just flip a switch and ask for a correction in a given year. We give the communities time to plan. I think we've been very clear about the need to do that within a given amount of time. And that's kind of what brings us to today.
Talk about the big picture questions.
Yeah.
Oh, capital budget.
This is just a very quick update because I had to add this information. When we transmit the tentative budget to the towns tomorrow and give them the 7 days prior to the public hearing that's in the regional agreement, we will always include this. So remember, this is just debt service. It's all excluded from Proposition 2.5. That's what happens when the taxpayers vote to approve each of the construction projects. And we did roll off some debt in fiscal 23 when we paid the little stub, the last portion of the middle school, high school. We did 3 debt issuances. There was a little small one at the end, about $2 million. We made the last payment last year. So that's why we're expecting to see in a 7.5% decline we're still assuming that we're gonna have that last little bit for the Memorial School project is still being floated with short-term interest-only debt, bond anticipation notes, a very small cost for the current year. I think it's about 28,000 in the fiscal 23 budget. I've got about 45,000 in the tentative budget because we know that the rates will go up. It's still off a basis of 1.3 million bucks. So these numbers are good. They're coming down. They're really separate from the operating budget, but just to let people know what's happening. And we do generally assume that debt in a given year, when you're not adding new debt service, should be declining each year based on how we've structured it. Yes.
So this is separate and it's 30 million. Who managed the capital budget? Is it still the school committee?
School committee approves the capital budget and votes both budgets every year. If you look at the full budget document that's on our website from fiscal 23 and for every year prior, there's two separate budgets. And when we go to town meeting, that we ask them to vote and approve both of them separately. We do need ultimately a budget adoption by the school committee on both of them. For the debt service, because we know our debt service schedule is out until, we borrow, here's the debt schedule, here's how much you owe every fiscal year. It's very predictable. Everyone knows what those payments are going to be, and they're apportioned based on whatever inputs in the model, in the formula were when we issued the debt. So it's just very predictable and it's excluded, and people don't tend to worry about it, but we do provide the updates and you will need to take a vote.
Not a lot of conflict on that one.
Yeah. We will, I guess the last thing I would say is we issued that short-term debt in March. It's the last little stubble. We're waiting for MSBA to give us the final number, and then we'll know how much will be our share and how much will be their share. That's when we can bond permanently. Until then, it's a floating amount. And so that will come up for a redo in March. So we will have a revoting of we will issue a new short-term debt for another year. That's our estimate about how long we'll need it.
Where do the revenue coming from for the capital budget?
100% billed to the towns, no other revenue, 100% from the towns. If there are some, on the old debts, Mass General Law said if you got a premium when you issued your debt, that needed to be used to lower the bill to the towns. So you can see in the budget lines, there's that premium, it's like 15,000 bucks a year. But other than a very small little slice on that, and it's all towns.
Is there also a proportionment formula for the
Yes.
capital budget?
Yep, and it's slightly different. It's based off of population and EQV at the time of issuance.
Okay.
No enrollment factor
Yeah.
on debt.
You had said 6436.
Yeah, and I actually looked at the tentative numbers for, it's getting closer to 6733 for fiscal 24. It's blended off multiple debt
Yeah.
issuances. So it's very similar.
Okay.
All right.
All right, thanks for
So
that.
those are the numbers.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know a little bit about what the terminology is and what we're thinking about when we're building it.
Yeah.
So Anna's question's a good one, and I know it's on everybody's mind, like, so we're coming up to the public hearing, right? The questions we had before, I think, are the questions we need to answer going forward, which is this is just it. We've rolled forward everything. We've adjusted for enrollment where we can without diminishing service, but we haven't included three big buckets. I would think maybe these could be topics that we want some input in. And I would just say going forward, the hard question is not the spreadsheets. If you tell me, go and prepare a secondary budget that cuts the $760,000, that's not hard to do. The doing is not hard. The living with the outcomes is hard. The living with, whatever we pick to cut, there's a reason not to cut that and to cut something else. So there's a lot of emotion and the aftermath of it isn't good. And we wouldn't be putting our best foot forward for our kids at program. But the exercise of doing it isn't hard. So what I'm saying is we don't need to really worry about getting there on paper. We need to think big picture about the implications of our actions and our decisions. So on one hand, the question for the committee, we usually seek direction at this point. So do you want us to go and prepare a budget that reduces and keeps everyone at 3.5 or below? Do you want to consider some of the open items that could be built into the budget that would expand the budget and expand the ask? And then how do you want to handle the conversation about beyond the ask or beyond putting certain things in like replenishing reserves or funding a stabilization account or returning some programming? Do you want us to consider building a number that accounts for need to run 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Again, he's a whiz with Excel. That's not, coming up with the number isn't hard. It's coming up with the decision about thinking about our partners, thinking about our relationships. What is the right combination of things to ask for and the right package to put together? And that's the question before the committee. And that's the question I think we want input on from the public. But that's now for you to discuss and give us some direction.
Okay, so we're gonna take this a little bit methodically. So starting with the idea that even just taking kind of one step back, so if we are able to discuss what our viewpoints are here tonight, then the people, I assure you, our town partners, leaderships are paying attention to this conversation to get a sense of where we are as a committee, then they'll be able to be more informed with their questions and their input that they share next week based on what we are feeling and thinking as well. And so I'd like us to start this conversation with a really simple recognition that that we have choices here. We've been talking about this and taking aside what we know would be the recommendation for all the reasons, but recognizing that we do have our town partners to consider, we do have choices. There has to be a correction of some sort, but it can be passed on to our towns. It can be, we could technically vote to use more reserves. We could vote to ask for more cuts. We could do a blend of any of those things. But it's a good idea right now, since we've been talking about this for a while, to get a sense of where we are as a committee in terms of that. In terms of that question, are we interested in asking them to go through that, knowing that you guys are going to have, I mean, you said in the packet too, that you're going through the exercise of creating a budget in case we choose to go for this correction through our towns, if we pass it on to our towns and it fails for some reason, they've got a backup plan. But what are we hoping for here? So what I want this to be right now, and this is for our benefit and for everyone's, is a discussion among us about how we feel about this. Yeah, Kate, go ahead.
I feel as though the amount of that gap, the size of that gap, the amount of the correction has snowballed to such a point that the district cannot absorb that on its own and maintain the program and the level of education that our taxpayers are used to receiving. I think that it would be a major hit to our program to try to absorb all of those costs without asking the towns to help us with that. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, go ahead, Erica. Yeah, just go right around.
I echo Kate's thoughts, and beyond that, I think knowing what we know about the state of Essex Elementary School and even the aging state of this building, the idea of having to try to support level programming through use of more reserves would put us in a position where we could suddenly be in a real emergency sense to alarm us, but we really could need that money. So I don't think we can continue to draw down on those.
Okay. That's a good point and a related point. This can be discussion as well. Like, I want everyone to go around and get their chances, but this can be a discussion. I think a related point on that is that, that a lot of, as has been pointed out before, a lot of districts did during the COVID, couple years of COVID extremes, ask towns for money for that, have town input to cover some of those costs. And the district ended up carrying the bulk of that through, reserve use and other uses without asking for that from the towns in that way. So that's a good point about the emergency funds really are for emergencies. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I think asking the towns is the right thing to do. I think cuts would be my last on the list. I think my comments last year at the similar time was burn the reserves all the way to keep the programs running if we have to. It's absolutely not the right way of doing it, but I'm last on the list for cuts. I thought the foreign language conversation last year, I was actually somewhat nervous at town meeting in Manchester.
Yeah.
When people were voting, because I thought they were voting for a budget that didn't include foreign language, and they were really upset that foreign language wasn't part of it. So I didn't even think that was going to be a concept. So one, I'm going to advocate to bring foreign language back as part of this. But also to the question about, do we want to see, I think the foreign language thing I know there were other things in the cuts from last year, but that was such an obvious thing that people could kind of visualize, like, this is what's gonna happen. So I think seeing, like, right now, yes, 700 and some odd $1,000, but like putting that stuff to it, I think would be a powerful thing. Like, this is what you're actually gonna lose. You know, it's not like it's not 60 grand or whatever foreign language. It's foreign language. So I think that would be a powerful thing to see, like, what would actually it entail to cut $700,000 out of it. And so, yeah, I'm in favor of going to the towns. I think this is unsustainable and it needs to be corrected.
Hold my thought on that for a moment. Jake, did you want to share anything?
So I think there's a couple of things to consider here. I completely echo everybody's statement here, which is, you know, we've been carrying the excess through use of reserves. We've built it to a point where we can't consciously draw it much further, especially not at the level that we would now need. And given future obligations, especially on the capital side, we have to plan for that. That said, so in terms of the short term, you know, what we have to do for next year, I fully in support of asking the towns to help us out and be partners in making that come together. I think one thing that we need to figure out, the ask of the community for input is important here, right? And I think the question of, you know, what is the implication? I think we have an obligation to kind of show that we're being thoughtful about that. Don't just put out, it's going to be cuts of X magnitude and let everybody's imagination run wild about what that might be. We should be thoughtful about how we are doing that in a way that protects our priorities and you know, doesn't harm the program as much as we can. So I think it's important that we be thoughtful about that. I think it's also important that we need to figure out how to tell our story, because right now the only story that's being told is pay up or bad things happen. And I think there's a lot that we should be getting out there about our successes, and Pam has been good about noting a few of them in her comments, but they're not in any of the documents. They're not in the kind of story that we're telling. And what are our challenges and what are our needs and why are those a need, right? We should be telling that story, because if we don't, others will. And so I think it's, you know, on the 14th, it's not just, are we getting input on use reserves or not, which seems to be the only question on the table at the moment. But
In literally this second, yes, but we're going to go to another question after.
okay, so then I'll come back to this then, but I think we need to figure out how to be proactive about the story we're telling and the input we're gathering to help our decision making.
If at this very point, we're talking about a reserve or use the reserve, whether we should, are you asking right now is all or nothing, or is there somewhere in between?
No, I'm asking for just our initial take, given what we've all been talking about for a few months now on passing this on to towns versus reserve use versus cuts or any combination thereof.
So nobody wants to
We're
use the
looking for
reserve.
direction.
Nobody wants to use the reserves.
Well, some people do. Yeah, actually. So just
But-
phrase
but
it in
on-
you.
But only if,
Yeah, only if.
It's second in my
Right.
list. But cuts isn't second for me. Reserves is second.
but only if the towns don't support it.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Towns would like us to use reserves.
in the public hearing, it will be the townspeople as well, right, to discuss about this, yes? So to me, it's about understanding the other side too. So if you're gonna be talking about the reserve, whether we cut our reserve, like we don't wanna cut a reserve. I think they're gonna think that we don't wanna cut a reserve either. We don't wanna raise taxes. We don't wanna do that. So what I would recommend is what I would do is to kind of study what they have been doing in the past few years. And you probably know on top of your head, but I wouldn't know. So I would look at Manchester, how have they been using the reserve? Same with Essex. What are what are some of their sacrifices that they had to absorb in the past? And then so we can understand from their perspective before you go into it.
Mhm.
What's their mindset? What is their appetite that they would absorb additional, 279K for Essex, for example, or the rest for Manchester. So you have an understanding if, what they're thinking.
Yeah, and I think we've been doing that. I guess
I mean, do you guys?
that's what
I-
I've been literally spending all my time doing.
So-
I
so
think
this-
that
so
we-
This is a little
this
bit
is
of
where-
question about process then.
Yeah.
You and, you're not here, are
Mhm.
are representatives, right? So how does that, I mean, that's the kind of information that you've been engaged in this conversation about. How does that, you do these short report outs occasionally, but they don't get us that kind of information. So how do we learn about that? I mean, other than us going to, but then we have.
Well, that is
quorum-
literally how.
But then we have a quorum at the events, right?
If we need to post in order, well, first of all, Essex never would run into that issue if the three of us went
Okay.
to Essex board things, but we could always find a way. But no, that is literally how this is done, is, I mean, we have our
You can
collaboration
attend As long
discussions.
as you don't deliberate.
Yeah, we're not deliberating with one another at someone else's meeting. Some of the other boards do choose to post if they think they're gonna have a quorum at something. But no, that's the engagement that I'm talking about, is that whether or not we are the 7 most well-informed people about our town's finances, we as a 7-person block make really big decisions about our town's collective finances.
Right.
And
But
so.
we also have 2 of us as representatives in that, so that we don't have to attend all those, right?
No, we don't. That is not, Chris, and my role is to literally be attending all of those meetings.
but-
I
That's
think
not
he
how.
meant
this
you and
works.
I attend the collaboration.
The
meeting.
collaboration.
Oh, yes, we
That's what I
attend the
meant.
collaboration group. So at collaboration, we get a good sense of what the town board leaders who are represented
Yeah.
there, what they're thinking. And we get a lot of opportunity to give them information so that they can be planning. But what each town's leadership would like to see and what each town as a whole would support is also going to be kind of different. So for instance, with the public hearing coming up in December, it's traditionally been attended by the boards. It's not a widely attended thing by parents and things, to come and give us their feedback. That's who's going to be at those. So if we take just the input from them, we're having one side of it. We have to do the assimilation of that info.
To answer your question, just to follow up, in that collaboration, they don't go into that kind of details. What I would do before I go into budget negotiation is to really do my own homework. In that situation, I'll probably reach out to the individual town finance people to understand the finance in detail. What is the decision and the reserve balance, and what is the usage for the past few years before I go into it. But that's not in the collaboration meeting. It's probably that more side one-on-one to understand the
Yeah.
data.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I guess a lot of this comes down to me about, and I think we've brought this up in prior meetings, like, what is this public meeting really about?
Mhm.
And I've always assumed that it was a public meeting, right, that it's meant to get community input. But really what I keep hearing, and I think what you just said again, is that this meeting is really about getting that town leadership input.
Not policy-wise, it's about anyone who wants to attend. It's absolutely, that's just historically what has been the case.
But it is important for town leadership to hear from community members at this public meeting who have strong feelings either way. And that, I think the problem that Teresa's getting at is that doesn't always happen.
And I would say as a community member who attended a number of those meetings,
Mhm.
I couldn't provide input because it was literally this level of conversation of 3.5 versus 4.2. And that means nothing to community members who are not engaged in this conversation we're having right now.
Right, but, so that's why it is on us to have conversations with people outside of this meetings. We'll do our best in the public hearing, but in the end, we have to make these decisions. And even one public hearing shouldn't be our only input to that. It should be all of the meetings we've had up to it, all the conversations we've had with community members and town leadership as well.
Can I ask, so
Mhm.
based on your experience, how can we change that then?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. What I'm trying to figure out is what is the question we're asking of the community at that public meeting? Is it whether or not we use reserves? Is that the question, or are there other questions to ask?
There will be other questions to ask. Right now, I'm literally asking us, what is our just direction that we're headed? It sounds like the direction we as 6 plus Chris are headed is in one way to pass the cost on to towns. That's what we're talking about right now. So at the community here, at the public hearing, that will be a different question, but we still have to talk about what would be our priorities beyond this. So right now, we're just trying to get a sense from the people at the table who actually will be voting on this. So maybe what I'm hearing you say is you don't want to create, or you're not ready to form an opinion until after you have more input?
Well, maybe I don't know what questions you have on your list there.
Okay.
And I think it's because before we started this, Pam was asking, I kind of follow up on what we talk about is, what do we want to achieve in the next week's public hearing?
Mhm.
And then you started talking about the reserve. And I think that's what you're saying is, are we trying to talk about reserve in the public hearing or not? Or it's maybe someone.
Yes, Teresa,
So-
could you just outline the rest of this comment?
Sure, that,
Right.
I didn't
I think
expect it to be
that's-
quite so
that's what I'm gonna-
complicated. So
Yeah.
what I'm trying to get at here is a sense from this body as to what appetite we have for passing the costs on versus not, because that's going to inform the conversation about reinstatement, stabilization contribution, or reserves replenishment.
Right.
If everybody here is saying, yes, we're ready to pass the costs on to our town partners, then when we say, okay, well, of these 3 things, what are we going to start? What are we going to start with? What are our priorities? And we're going to do that. Then the feedback we get at the public hearing is going to be, this is how I feel about, this is how that would impact this town. This is how that would impact this town. This is what I care about, that sort of thing. So if we get a sense here of what the priorities are, but if we, for instance, if we were all sitting here and said, you know what, our towns can't handle anything, we need a cuts package right now, then we don't need to talk about reinstatement. We don't need to talk about a stabilization contribution. We need to talk about them cutting. What I'm trying to acknowledge for all of us and for our people paying attention is that it's not a given. Like, we have to make that choice as to what direction we're heading with
Okay,
this.
then.
That's where I'm
then
going.
In my mind, I'm gonna reframe this conversation in my mind
Sure.
as preparation for kind of, and we've talked a little bit about having kind of 3 scenarios, right? Kind of level services scenario, aspirational scenario, and a cut scenario, right? And part of our duty is essentially to prepare those 3 in my mind, right?
Okay.
We could make a decision to go one way or the other. But if we are looking for input, public input, people need to see what those look like in order to give us input. If we say it's only gonna be one or the other,
Yeah.
then we aren't asking, and we aren't able to ask the questions to differentiate whether or not those are viable.
Go ahead, Pam.
You've got 2 public hearings.
Yeah.
This public hearing is just the preliminary budget. This is the forecast. It's not written in stone. They're real numbers, but they're estimates. Your January 4th hearing is when you're gonna have 3 scenarios. If you choose to ask for 3 scenarios, yes,
Way later.
24th.
Okay,
20
thank you.
digit.
Panic. Okay.
That's when we'll likely have, if the
The
direction
scenarios
is
to look
create
at.
scenarios, we'll have the red, the white, and the green, the go forward, the stable, the reduce, just like we did last, many years ago now, 8 years ago. Decisions tonight will inform what things go in each of those budgets.
Okay, so then we are then,
Or you could say, we don't want to see a cut package.
Well, that's what, yeah,
You
that's
know,
what I'm,
You're using pass the cost on. I would argue that it's a cost that is their responsibility.
I strategically want to see a cuts package because I want to see a stereo.
so that's what, I haven't shared my opinion on this yet either. Taking from what's been shared here too, I think that it sounds like the temperature here is that we recognize that this has been done over years. We're not in a sustainable position anymore to keep utilizing reserve funding, that it's impacting other things moving forward. I would like to see what it would look like as a cuts package without reserve use. I'm personally not inclined to ask for you guys to put any effort into things that involve using our reserves for the operating budget for the upcoming year. Because we've been doing that and that's how we got to this hole. We have to have a reset. My other concern is if we had, which I know we don't, but it's on the list gets long, a reserve policy, this whole thing would be a lot simpler if we had a reserve policy guiding us. And I've been looking at Essex's as well, so I know that's something on the list. But the other thing that I think would be helpful is if we are looking at doing this without reserves or cuts and handling it through the assessment, then looking at a 3 and a 5 year carry forward, because the next time we have an infusion with EES timeline is not going to be for a while. And so I think we need to be prepared. And part of the input that I would seek at the public hearing on that would be from town leaders who are paying attention to help us know how that would impact them. That if we had enough of an ask to carry us through 3 years of this again, or 5 years of this again, how that's going to impact what they need to do to make up that difference. That's my thought on that. Is there anyone here who's interested? Is there anyone here who's interested in utilizing reserves? Like who's just right now wants to say, yes, we're ready to do that?
I just want to specify that when I say I would prefer not to use reserves, or when I say I think that it's not prudent for us to use reserves at this point, that is not, to me, that doesn't feel like a choice. To me, that feels like I just read the Habib report. The number of repairs that could be imminent in Essex Elementary in the next 2 years exceed the amount of money that is in our reserves account. So we literally do not have that money to spend on operating expenses because one emergency, but we have to replace that roof.
Okay.
We're done. There's nothing left in that account. And that's not us saying, oh, but what if we have to replace the roof? That's us saying, well, we've had a survey done and the roof will need to be replaced at some point.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of if.
And the mechanism there would be, we would have to go to a special town meeting to have funds given to us to repair the roof and explain why, if we knew all of these things were potential, why we didn't get anything.
But I'm confused about that. If we do need to do something significant like that to replace the roof, multi-million dollars, that will go into the capital budget though. It wouldn't come from the reserve, only if it's emergency.
It would need to be voted into the
Capital
capital
budget.
budget as a new exclusion, in which case you're asking people to do a Proposition 2.5 exclusion. That's the capital budget is all excluded from Prop 2.5. So you're voting on that anyway. So you've got to go to taxpayers and say, not only are you voting on it, but are you voting to exclude it from Prop? It's a town meeting vote and a ballot referendum.
Not all
Anytime you go
votes
over
that
Prop
count.
2.5, you've got to have a vote. And this 6.53% would also require that unless the towns come in with a different way to fund it through their other budgetary.
So then maybe, I mean, directionally, I think you're getting the sense here. So maybe we could talk about these things then and get a sense for what people's priorities are in terms of these buckets that the tentative budget currently doesn't include. If we start with where we are, based again on the conversations we've had, paying attention last year, then when our town partners or the community or other community members come to the public hearing, they can offer feedback based on what we've shared here. So as an example, I will go straight out on a limb and say I'm personally open to the idea of some reinstatement conversations. I'm especially open to a stabilization contribution because that makes the most sense given what we have, but I don't love the idea of talking about a reserves replenishment right now because we're already asking towns to correct for the use that we've offered. So it's basically them catching up to what the district has already put in. I think it might be, again, assuming that whatever the ask is includes, a 3 or a 5 year ability to manage. Just a straight replenishment, I think would be a really hard ask on our town partners right now. So that to me is a non-starter, but I'm interested in your thoughts about all of these buckets.
So to me, I can't answer that question because I don't have the insight on the town partners that you do.
Sure.
And my assumption has been these public sessions are where we get input to help inform that prioritization.
Okay.
And so to me, the task would be outlining for the community, here is what it means to replenish reserves or not, and here are the implications of doing that. Is that a priority? Here is what could be on the table for reinstatement and what the implications of that are. What do you think? Here are the implications of adding to stabilization. Is that a priority for you? That's the kind of input that then informs us in making the decision.
That's fair for your outlook on that. Again, I get a lot of community input all the time, not just from collaboration. So that is part of our role, is to be seeking and having that. So I can understand if you're willing to reserve your opinion until after that. How's everyone else feeling?
I'll, This is the philosophical side, the practical side. I think practical stabilization contribution. From a school perspective or philosophical perspective, I guess, in my opinion, like reinstatement, like the best schools have the best programs, the best teachers, the highest paid teachers. And I think it's reduced staff reductions, service cuts. I think if you want to maintain your status as one of the best school districts in the state, you put those dollars and prioritize that. Not to say you can't have a school building fall down, obviously, or have floods and leaks and stuff like that. But from a philosophical perspective, reinstatement would be my highest priority. And I mean, both, definitely both.
Yeah.
And I agree with you on the reserves replenishment. It's like, we don't want to spend reserves, now give us money and we want to start replenishing our reserves. I get that. I think over time, obviously you need to start replenishing reserves because you have to have a rainy day fund, especially with a $30 million budget. That can be plus or minus a lot and reserves can hit that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of where I fall.
Kate, did you want to follow? And then-
Yeah, I think that we all need to be mindful of the fact that we're a regional school committee. And I think that we all have a natural instinct to advocate for our individual towns. And I see that personally as my responsibility as well. I want to be really careful that we don't create a scenario in which we have towns pitted against each other and in which one town is perceived as holding the other town back, especially knowing that there is already some friction between students between the two towns when they come together at the middle school, or that there can be some friction. And so I want to make sure that we are having a conversation about meeting the needs of both communities rather than meeting the needs of our own communities. I hear what you're saying. I want to bring programs back also. From an educational standpoint, from a budgeting standpoint, I feel like we need to fill the gap and put money into stabilization before we can start thinking about that.
Okay. Go ahead, Erica.
So I guess I'm gonna somewhat echo Matt's statement that the best schools have the best programming and the best teachers. And to get us there, and getting us there matters in so many different ways. Because whether you have kids in the program or not, we all know these things. And I'm gonna just reiterate, it impacts everybody's property tax values. It impacts a lot of things. It impacts your pride in your community. So while I know the budgetary issues are real, I also think we shouldn't lose sight of that number one goal of servicing our students and building the program that most of us join this committee because we really believe in. Seeing foreign languages cut in particular, when I'm looking at the reinstatement line, that's the piece that to me, I would most seriously advocate to try to consider, at least to have that in our first pass, because I think there's so much good evidence, and you guys all reviewed it last year, and I know you were faced with an impossible choice, but I really think there's great evidence to support having foreign language at earlier ages, and I think we should try to include it. The staffing reductions, I'm less concerned with because it does seem like we've been able to deal with some of those through natural attrition. And as we see declining enrollment, it sounds like that can continue. So that part doesn't concern me quite as much. Stabilization contribution, that's not fun. It doesn't like speak to me the same way, having really strong programs does, but I understand that that's the fiscally responsible thing to do. I agree with what everyone said about reserve replenishment. That would be great, but I don't think that can happen right now. We're already going to face a pretty big ask. And I think we've got to be practical in what we think we can achieve.
Can I do a thing here? Pam might be mad at me after I do this, but that's okay. Raise the idea that reinstatement, if there is a conversation about reinstatement, that it might be a little bit broader. I'm sorry, because I'm thinking of things that, for instance, if we were looking at a line item, of X number of dollars to reinstate some things, and it came down to the late bus versus all K-6 foreign language versus just grade 6 foreign language, and perhaps a stronger health curriculum or health education, or the arts director position, that sort of thing, that's something that would be part of that conversation of reinstatement doesn't just have to mean things that were actually cut. But also we have to be mindful that there are much bigger implications and work at the district level, administrative level, but I think it's something we should be thinking of.
Well, and just to piggyback on that, I feel like the foreign language, elementary foreign language was a hot item, right? Obviously, it was much talked about. It was a very tangible way to put our finger on something that was cut. If we were talking about having a foreign language program at the elementary level again, I would hope that our conversation would be not just be hiring a teacher to teach that, but it would be about, okay, so what does an effective foreign language program at the elementary level look like? Is it 35 minutes once a week? Are our students actually getting the benefit of that program that we're paying for, or should we be perhaps considering a different model, and what would the cost for an effective model or a more effective model be?
And this is a little bit of the
Sorry, this is
aspirational
like
ask that
way
you've
off
been,
and-
that you're
No.
talking about too, but on a small,
Thank you.
yeah.
Because I do think while there was a lot of emotion around the language discussion, there wasn't a lot of evidence. There was a lot of testimony. But we didn't have a data pool to pull from to
Right.
say that based on the 45 minutes once a week, that the kids are making X amount of gains. I think the language program is in cycle to be reviewed, to be aligned with the curriculum. So we could do reinstatement in a lot of ways. It doesn't mean the exact same thing needs to come
Right.
back next fall. It could be a long-term plan to look at returning that FTE in maybe sixth grade comes back, maybe it's health. I mean, it
Yeah.
could be a lot of different things. I think we're also going to have to wrestle with time on learning. And is the time on learning for elementary right now, given what we're seeing in some of the data, better served with 45 minutes more of writing, or is it, or STEM, or is it better served with a pull-up? So I think there's a lot of different ways to get at it. Let me think a little bit about how we can talk about
Yeah.
building back, but not just replacing one for one.
Go ahead, Anna.
So for me, it's hard to talk about the benefit of specific program, like the foreign language, the arts and whatever, because we don't know, we're not experts. We also don't have the data. But what we know is, to echo all you guys are all saying, is to have the best program, to be one of the good school districts. We also need to stay competitive. There are other schools that have foreign language from K to 12, and we don't. There are other schools that have whatever it is that we don't. So it's not just about the budgetary, trust me, as a finance person, it's all about building the reserve and, a budget decision. But it's also understand who your audience is. So circle back, if the next week public hearing, the key audience is the community people, then I think it will be helpful to what you're saying is the list, don't quit budget cuts, the list of the things that potentially it could be impacted. Also, the list of the things potentially could be reinstated. How much does it cost, plus or minuses? And then I think it will push people to really think about what's important to them. If maybe the cut only needs to be, I'm making this up, maybe we only need to cut 200K. What does that mean? So people start to look at what is important to them, then they can start having the input. Otherwise, that public hearing just becomes another town meeting. I mean, the public.
No,
the
I
information.
agree.
Yeah.
I think that's the January 24th meeting.
Right.
So
But
next
let's
week is.
no, next week is, this is the big picture. This is the preview of what the budget is. And I would argue your audience next week is primarily people who are heavily invested in each community's most heavily invested budget watchers. Whether they're citizens or whether they're elected town boards, because they're gonna want the preview on where the numbers might land and how it might impact town budget and tax implications for the year. But let's go back and just highlight. The cut, right now, to go back and do a cut budget, $756,000 is what we need to cut. Right, so that's not, nothing's coming back. And we're gonna hope we can achieve a lot of it through enrollment. The current projection of budget with 656K is the deficit between 3.5 and a correction includes a four-head reduction. And we could take those heads out and start to look at building that program. So, I mean, there's already, remember, we're under $1 million, but we're nearing $1 million, and that's a lot of cutting, so.
So maybe one thing we could do, I had a thought while you were saying that, is that, because I think that part of this is going through the process and seeing, and I know you've attended the public hearings, but seeing how this has changed given different time, different group, different everything. As we come into the meeting next week, maybe we can be prepared as well. That might be a chance if some of our town partners are there, in a moderated fashion, if you have questions for them. I don't think that would be entirely out of line.
It's usually give and
It's,
take.
this can be a back and forth. So you can consider it like a giant collaboration group. If that ends up being the bulk of who, we have there, it would be an appropriate time to ask some of those questions and get some of that feedback.
And you could even probably read the room, and if you do end up with a lot of parents in the room.
Yeah.
Ask the question, okay, we're going to be asking Pam and Avi to go back and build us a couple of budget scenarios. One of them is a growth budget or an investment budget. We've heard from the Performing Arts Group, they'd like to see a fine arts director.
Right.
We've heard from people who are supporters of world language that they'd like to see world language back. In the room, what's
What
on
do you
your
care
mind if we're
about?
thinking about building forward? You just let them have
Yeah.
a free reign. We can kind of harness that, repackage, come in January with new numbers. Hopefully, we're still at the 750 and present something to you. I think we're on the 10th that shows a budget in each direction. And then we can go on the 24th with more specific public input questions
Is next week gonna be hybrid or virtual?
No, we're in person.
in person.
Oh, in person.
We're in person.
Where? Here.
Hybrid option.
Yeah, we'll do this.
Well, I mean, yeah, people will be
People
able
can
to
dial.
attend, but we're an
We'll be here.
in-person meeting
Yeah.
for next week. And then the January one we hold at Essex, right?
Yep.
Yeah, the second public hearing we do at Essex Elementary. Go ahead, Jake.
So what I like about the turn the conversation just took, and Kate, I think you kicked us off on this, which is, it's not about the thing that was cut, but it's about the nature of the program that we're trying to move towards. And what I like about that is it brings us back to the strategic plan.
I'm
And it-
shocked, Jake, I'm shocked.
I know. And it brings us back to what we're trying to accomplish, right? It's not just, and we have, I personally think we have to be very careful to say that excellent schools just means we have everything that everybody else has. That is not the way we should go about this. We should be looking at our vision of the graduate. We should be looking at our strategic plan and saying what programs get us those things. Not just, school X has 15 APs, we should have 16. That is not the way to do it. So what I like about that is that means that we potentially could frame this as, a conversation about how we get excellent education and outcomes for our students without being about, do we bring a French teacher back, or do we bring a librarian back, or whatever it may be. And to me, that gets us that broader picture without it being about the specific reinstatement, so to speak, as we've been framed.
That's what works for you? Good.
It can't work for me. It's got to work for us, right?
Well, I don't think there's anything, that's not how I frame it in my head, but there's nothing different about. I think we're all working toward the same goal with the same process.
Okay.
I think it's just a different way of looking at it.
I'm hearing two different things. I'm hearing you want me?
Yeah, please.
I'm hearing identify the specific things that will be lost, or talk in broad concepts of investment, and I think there's merits to both. I don't need the clarity now. We've got a few weeks before we're building it, but there are two different ways to go after the same thing.
Well, I think that it's important that people understand that if we are talking about cuts, the things or the things that we can cut are very limited. Our
Mhm.
options are, I mean,
Yeah.
the reason that foreign language was even considered was because it is not a state requirement, right? So we're required to teach. Our kids are required to go to PE. Kids are required to have music education, science, reading, all of that.
So.
Foreign
so-
language is not a requirement at the elementary level. And so that was one of the things that could be cut. And there are actually not that many other options. And so I think that it's important for people to realize that if there are not programs or obvious cuts that can be made, then we're looking at potentially classroom teachers, and then we are looking at class size beyond
Mhm.
possibly what our standards have been.
So, point of clarification, which I think we should spend a little time with at some point, is what actually is required? Because most of the things you just put on the priority list are not actually required by the state. So I think it's gonna be worth us at some point to say, just so we know what our options are. Music is not required by the state. Even science is not required by the state.
Science is a state
Right.
standard.
There are 8 state standards,
So let me
including
bring my
arts,
chart up so we know. what
including
we're-
arts
yeah.
and, right, there's 8 frameworks.
Pam has a chart for
I have
that.
a
right.
chart for this.
But the only quote unquote requirements are very minimal. There's pressures like Mass Core and college admissions and whatnot that say kids should have these things in order, but they're not technically requirements for
But
it.
so like the Mass State curriculum frameworks for science, are you saying?
They're not required. There's 8 frameworks.
Can we
If
use
you
your
consider
chart?
the frameworks to be required, there's 8 of them, including computer science and digital literacy, health, comprehensive health, art. If you say the curriculum frameworks are required, then all 8 of those are required.
Let's look at Pam's chart.
I can send you across over,
Mhm.
there's a sheet that goes behind this which identifies things. The stuff we're talking about is common practices, right? So discretionary spending, I would put the specials at the elementary and the discretionary spending. But if you don't have them in every other town in the region and in the state, unless you're, in dire straits, has some version of that programming, you're putting our kids at a disadvantage competitive.
And I'm not saying we get rid of any of this. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying let's be aware of what our options are.
So yeah, maybe what we need to know is what are the program enhancements? What is in that top?
We're not even talking about.
No, we're talking about
We're talking about
bottom in the middle.
So you want to know what's from being cut
You
from
can't
there.
see me doing that on the screen.
No, I can't see
but-
you doing that. I'm not getting a sense from us that
Common
we're looking for a cuts package, that we're just looking
There's a definition.
to be able to help people understand what would be on the line.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask a question. In the packet, you did note as well that you are going through the exercise of coming up with the principles of a package based on, I thought it said like 1.3, but I could be wrong.
Mhm.
A lot in reduction on the chance that whatever we put forward for the towns does not pass. Do we need an extra exercise in that, or is that going to be sufficient?
In what way? I mean-
If people
I
are
mean, this-
looking to, if people are looking to understand what the cuts would look like, you're already going through that exercise.
We are,
And so will that be available in the same time frame for this budget process?
if you want it in January, we'll produce it in January.
And then, and I think on the opposite end of that, like the wish list
Mhm.
would be also something I'd like to see.
Are you saying though that we don't think we need it, or we just simply can't have it in time for the December hearing?
It's too early,
Yeah.
way too early. We don't even have a vision, a sense yet of what scheduling is gonna look like.
Of what?
Scheduling is gonna look like at the high school. The closer we get to kind of planning for that, the better off we're gonna be in terms of knowing what kids want and what the implications of cuts will be on them.
So it sounds to me like 95% of our conversation here is really about preparing for January.
Not the public hearing.
No,
Not-
I'm
not
gonna
the
drag you
December.
back a little bit and I don't
Yeah.
want to prolong it because it's going to 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
I think you have some big strategy decisions to make because there are positives and negatives to putting out the cut list. And then there are positives and negatives to creating a big aspirations list.
Mhm.
And I think the group probably wants to talk a little bit about who truly is your target audience. Because depending on how you want to approach getting buy-in on this and getting endorsement, and maybe you don't want endorsement from your town boards, that might drive a little bit of your decision-making about how to structure things for the conversations that are coming up. Are you going broad? Are we taking it to, are we taking it beyond the boards and the arguments going straight to the broad community? Are we targeting the boards and the people who invest their time and energy and come into these type of meetings? Like, I think the message looks a little different, or the packaging of the message could be a little different depending on who the target audience is.
Message or
I have-
ask?
Both.
I'm feeling at this point kind of like, do you remember when we tried to work through our, like operating norms at our summer retreat? And we just weren't quite ready for that as a group. Like, maybe we need to get through next week. We're going to have people come, people who are paying attention right now. We've gotten a sense together here of where initially we are or where we're not even comfortable being at this point. If we get through next week, see who shows up, see what input we have, ask questions there as well. For those of us who don't feel like we've had a good opportunity to do that, ask questions of them also. And then we might be in a little bit more solid footing to understand going
Yeah, and I'd
forward.
encourage us all, like, get out and go to the board meetings and listen
yeah.
to what the conversation is there in terms of how they're processing through what happens when 50 to 60% of their budget hits at, 6 or 7% above where they are planning it to be. We could come out of next week, and I see Ben's on the line. I'm not putting words in anybody's mouth, but we could come out of next week with an ask to bring it down to 2.5.
Right.
That's where the 2.5 comes from. You just don't know in term what we're going to get for feedback. And I think we just need to think a little bit more. Once we put out the list of reductions, that's going to shift a conversation in a different direction. In the meetings, we'll take on we'll need time and energy in the meetings to process inputs about that.
And just want to, like, with last year with collaboration meetings,
Mhm.
you kind of started getting a sense of where people were.
Yeah.
When do we get that sense? When is that reported to us about that sense?
We can give you a little sense right now of where the towns are. Tell me if I'm speaking out of turn, but from the collaboration, the last one was especially productive.
I wasn't there. I was,
Get that
I was out of,
Um,
I was out of the country.
this isn't a surprise to any of our towns. And so both of our towns are facing considerable capital concerns. Both towns, I mean, they have a lot on their plates. And, the school budget is a really large portion of it. But also, this is not news to either town, set of town leadership. Essex is looking at how to absorb whatever this ask might be. Both towns' leaderships are prepared, for this to come to them as a bigger ask. And they're looking at how to move forward with absorbing whatever the ask is. And they're really just sort of holding on with bated breath for what the number ends up being so that they can decide how do they choose to actually absorb this. Do they want to go for an override? That's on them to go for an override. Or do they want to absorb it through free cash? I know Essex has been really clear. They did a lot of work to stay flexible at the fall town meeting. Not doing a lot of spending free cash to leave some flexibility in case they need to utilize that. So
So then if the assumption is that we're going to ask for it,
Mhm.
then to your question about who's our audience, it seems like it's the general public. Because,
I think the amount matters.
okay, well, you said, you kind of, not you left that part, but it was like, how
No,
do we
like they're just
absorb?
waiting on the numbers.
But you
to
said,
know
that
yeah.
they're waiting on the numbers to then find out how to absorb it. You
Yeah.
didn't say, but they're waiting on the numbers to then tell us to cut it in half.
They could. I mean, there could be
Ann's
conversation.
here,
Yeah.
Ben and Jeff and Nina
think
are on
Ruth
the
is-
line. She might be there too. I don't know if they're comfortable, we're gonna put them on the spot.
We have a number.
Yeah,
now.
and would you like to,
Well, we have a number for
for a
just
starting
like-
for
point?
the years.
Yes, I'm just saying, like, there is a theoretical number. There is one of many numbers.
Right, right. But that could range from less than that number to significantly more than that.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, remember you're open, I mean, again, this is where we want to be really, really clear. This is preliminary budget. The two top variables, one is open contract and open not contract negotiation, so we don't have a settled number. And the other is healthcare, which we're conservatively budgeting at 10% and hoping it comes down, but it could potentially go up.
Yeah.
So this is probably and it includes a four-head reduction already. So this is,
Current December best guess.
I would argue that our audience right now for December is town leaders and board leadership. And then in January is the more general public, once we have a direction where we're going that our town boards can start to absorb or start to support.
So I think what makes this partly difficult, at least for me, it's the first time I'm going through it as a school committee member, so that's part of it. But the other part of it is this is a fairly unique ask, right? This is a once in a 5 to 7 or 10 year moment that we typically ask for some sort of major correction, right?
Mhm.
And I think part of what would be useful is, is there, now that and Matt, thank you for asking it in a way that I couldn't. Now that we have a sense of kind of where that collaboration group is thinking, maybe it's helpful to get a sense of what is that tipping point between something that they might be able to absorb versus having to go to the community.
Mhm.
Because that then changes both the message, whether or not they are our audience or the community is our audience, to Matt's point, are very different scenarios.
so for those who haven't been through it before, the way we go into town meeting is we're in the audience. The lead for each of the towns, so Teresa for Essex, Chris for Manchester will give a public address, 3-minute public address framing the budget. But then it gets turned over to the boards to speak on behalf of the schools and offer an endorsement of the budget. So they are key to our budget, to our budget making it onto the ballot.
You're talking about February.
Town meeting.
Talking about town
Annual.
meeting in
April,
April
May.
and May.
April.
So they're a key partner in I think their endorsement at town meeting or lack thereof is critical to whether or not we're gonna have success.
So what if we said, given the hour, what if we said again? Now I just put a candy cane in my
Ben
mouth.
put his camera on.
I have something to say.
But it's also late and we're
Okay.
doing this on the spot. And we
Yeah.
do have a meeting next week where we're especially formed to be just like available for conversation. So why don't we, in the meantime, do our homework? Come up with our questions for them for that dialogue as well. That might be kind of a shift, in fact, in how we do things. But also, I do really encourage us each to be in contact with our town partners. You're welcome to email or drop by or, well, maybe don't drop by, but email or call and make an appointment to talk to your town administrator, talk to Board of Selectmen, whether it's the rep, that helps with school committee or not. They are a wealth of knowledge and they are willing. I sent an email out to, a couple different people just last night and got a ton of information right back. So that's part of us doing our individual role to come to understanding with this too. But if we come next week with our own questions, that's a good time to ask them. Is there anything else we definitely need? Did you get a sense of what
I do.
you were hoping for? Okay. Because that's really the goal is for you to know what direction you're going with some things.
So for next week, obviously Pam and Avi have a big role in sharing the tentative budget.
Mhm.
But the framing of the big picture question, can we get that clearer for that event? Because I'm feeling like this conversation may have helped us do that. But Pam, if you just go to your I hope the diverging road, cuts, funder cuts is not how we're presenting it there. Or is that fundamentally how we're presenting the,
My understanding of how we're presenting next year is that and Pam or Avi, stop me if I'm misunderstanding, is that this budget was designed without the use of reserves as a revenue source. Because we need to use our revenue, our reserve revenues for one-time costs like the turf field replacement, for a feasibility study for Essex Elementary School, which timeline, there are potential timelines at this point, and for emergency planning in that way. That's why it's been developed this way. You've heard what the conversation is. What are your inputs on that? That's my understanding of the framing. We're not really trying to tell a story so much at this point.
We're telling the story of.
That is the
how we
story.
build the budget.
Yeah.
What, the key variables are projected to be at this point, what the implication of these assumptions are on our deficit.
Mhm.
And I think I'm asking the question of the committee, and if you want to seek feedback on that, great. If you want to ask them a different question, that's fine. But the committee's question is, what direction are we going to balance our budget?
And in the end, with whatever
That's the
feedback we
question
get or
before us.
don't,
How do we balance the
we have to
budget?
decide that.
how, balance the budget next year or over the next 5 years?
The correction needs to reset the bar to move us so that we're not using reserves, so that the towns catch up in the revenue input column, so that we can reassume our 3.5% growth rate. And I think there probably will be debate on 3.5% growth rate, but our target rate for the next coming years.
That's why I think it'll be important at some point soon to kind of know the multi-year plan for the district. So we can see how that's aligned with the two different towns. And
We could do that. We can model out the multi-year, it's a model. It's not the plan.
Yeah,
It's a
I-
multi-year model. And it'll let us put in, okay, we've got
It's not a
4%
commitment.
personnel, we've got 10% healthcare. It's gonna be, we project this is the assessment for the coming year.
yeah,
I think what that tool will really help us with is taking what is currently a fiscal 24 deficit and helping us to say, what does that look like if you're trying to have a correction that lasts you 3 years? What does it look like if it's getting you to 5 years? I don't know that that's for the public hearing next week, because really the public hearing is typically this budget with public inputs after
And
you guys have
questions.
had a chance to say, what are your questions? What are your things that you don't see or that are essential?
Yeah.
But that is definitely part of the work we need to do for January, because, well, to adopt a budget and go back to town meeting with that budget, I think is gonna, we already know it's right now in excess of typical Prop 2.5.
Mhm.
How do we, to Erica's point, want to not be back at the same thing in fiscal 25? I think we have to answer that question. The multi-year tool will help us do that, and I think we could incorporate that into our January work. So we can refine our vision, our multi-year vision.
I think you have Ben in the chat.
Okay. And again, I'm
We
gonna pull
do
you.
want to wrap.
Yes.
Can I just come back to the public event?
Yep.
That last line, right? MERSD must determine the direction it wants to take to balance the budget, right? But the question is not reserves and program cuts or all program cuts, right? That's not the question for that meeting, right?
That's exactly the question. That is the question. That's why I was trying to get a temperature on it tonight about where we are initially.
But didn't we, as a group, didn't we put a proposed answer to that?
Yep, we got a temperature initially, and then at that meeting, our town partners or whoever shows up is going to give input, and then we might choose to revise our thoughts
I mean, we
based on the input that comes
You
in.
can add another. You want to put none of the above, or I'll find better words, it's getting late, and we can put that on there. I mean, you can make that, I don't, take the slide out, throw no question on. I'm just.
Well, I mean, I guess the fourth option is increase the assessment. Is that what you're saying, that part's missing there?
That part is definitely missing, but I mean, is it for the public to tell us whether or not it's program cuts or reserves?
No, that's why we're having this conversation, and then they're welcome to give their input, but then we continue to
And
have,
we're
in the
telling-
end, we
and
have to.
That is saying we're telling the public. MERSD must determine, like, the public isn't MERSD.
Are we using this slideshow?
You don't have to.
I-
I mean, yes,
I don't
typically this
really
is what
wanna
we.
get into
I'll open
that
up
we
right
can
now.
talk it.
another
I
conversation.
really
The
don't want
the
to open
slideshow is fine. I'm just bothered by this, like, it's all cuts or nothing, because there are other options and there are.
Well, these are the only ones in your control. Maybe that's a better way to put it. These are directly in your control. The other one is we're going to reach out and collaborate with town partners to try to execute a correction.
And Ben, I don't mean to put off if you're in the chat saying something, but I don't want to open another whole we need to focus on wrapping this up for tonight as well.
Just said, could I say something before you?
I'd rather we not. Respectfully, I would just, because otherwise I really feel like it would only be fair to open it up to any of our town partners, and we are running late and we are going to have the opportunity for exactly that next Wednesday. I'm seeing nods.
I will-
Is that?
I will tweak the question.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, is there anything, so again, I get that this feels like it got convoluted. I think Pam and Avi got what they needed from the sense of the conversation. It will become more clear to us as we go forward, for sure. In the meantime, let's all do our own homework and come prepared to the next meeting. Okay, closing continued business. School committee comment. Okay, thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Barrington, so moved.
Is there a second?
Second, Spencer.
All in favor?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, that's unanimous.
I was this close to doing
unanimous.
6 months prep
Are
one
we
D1
allowed to
football.
make a public comment in
Thank you.